My name is Elise. I am 33 years old, and for my entire life, I chased the approval of a family that only saw me as a convenience. Last Thanksgiving, I spent $4,000 to host a luxurious private holiday dinner in downtown Chicago to celebrate making junior partner at my auditing firm. I invited my parents, my sister, and our extended relatives. But as the clock ticked past 3 in the afternoon, I sat in a grand empty room. Not a single person showed up. I pulled out my phone only to discover they were all gathered at my sister's new mansion laughing and broadcasting their betrayal live to the internet. I sat there alone, eating in humiliation. But then my grandmother walked in and placed an envelope in my hand. I opened it, and the truth left me stunned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been abandoned by the people who should have loved you the most. The private dining room at the Chicago Steakhouse was breathtaking. I had reserved it 3 months in advance, paying a premium to ensure every detail was perfect. A long mahogany table stretched across the center of the room, covered in a crisp white linen tablecloth, and set with gleaming crystal glasses and polished silver flatware. Elaborate autumnal floral arrangements sat at the center, featuring deep red roses and golden lilies that I had personally selected. Soft jazz music played from hidden speakers, creating an atmosphere of sophisticated warmth. The restaurant staff hovered near the edges of the room, wearing crisp black uniforms and sympathetic expressions that were slowly breaking my heart. I looked down at my watch. It was 3:15 in the afternoon. The reservation had started at 1 o'clock. For over 2 hours, I had been sitting at the head of a table meant for 20 people completely alone. I had paid $4,000 for this afternoon. The menu featured prime rib roasted turkey with truffle stuffing, artisanal sides, and expensive wines that my father always pretended to be an expert on. I had spent the money because this was supposed to be my moment. After working 80-hour weeks for the past 7 years, missing vacations, and sacrificing my personal life, I had finally been named a junior partner at my financial auditing firm. It was a massive professional milestone. I wanted to celebrate it with the people who mattered most. I wanted to finally hear my parents say they were proud of me. Instead, I was listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the room. I picked up my phone for the 20th time. My screen was entirely blank. No text messages, no missed calls, no apologies for bad traffic or terrible weather. The skies outside the floor-to-ceiling windows were perfectly clear. I opened my contacts and called my mother, Patricia. It rang 4 times before going straight to voicemail. I left another message, keeping my voice unnaturally bright and steady, so she would not hear the panic creeping into my throat. I told her the food was ready and asked if they were close. Then I called my father, Richard. His phone went straight to voicemail without ringing even once. He had turned it off. I tried calling my sister Brittany, but her phone also went directly to a full mailbox. A suffocating sense of dread began to settle over my chest. I took a sip of ice water to clear the lump forming in my throat. Growing up in our family meant living in a constant state of comparison. My parents were obsessed with country club status and outward appearances. They cared more about what their wealthy friends thought of them than they cared about their own daughters. But their treatment of me and my sister Brittany was vastly different. Brittany was 30 years old and the undisputed golden child. She called herself a lifestyle influencer, spending her days posting heavily filtered photos of expensive lattes and designer handbags that our parents subsidized. Her husband Kevin was a self-proclaimed entrepreneur who was constantly pitching failed cryptocurrency schemes to anyone who would listen. They contributed nothing to society, but my parents treated them like royalty because Brittany looked good in family portraits. I was the boring one, the financial auditor who wore sensible suits and analyzed tax returns. When I graduated at the top of my class with a degree in accounting, my mother Patricia actually sighed and told me that numbers were not very glamorous. When I bought my first reliable sedan, my father Richard asked why I did not lease a luxury car to show people I was successful. They constantly made me feel like my practical choices were an embarrassment to their curated image. That was why this dinner was so important to me. I had finally achieved a level of financial and professional success that could not be ignored. I was a junior partner. I was making excellent money. I was hosting a dinner at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. I thought this would be the day they finally looked at me with respect. At 3:30, the restaurant manager approached me with a gentle apologetic smile. He quietly asked if the kitchen should begin plating the food or if I wanted to continue waiting. The pity in his eyes was almost worse than the empty chairs. I told him to wait just a little longer, claiming there must have been a massive pileup on the highway. As he walked away, I pulled out my phone again. I decided to check social media to see if there were any local news reports about traffic accidents or road closures. I opened my Instagram application, and the very first thing that popped up at the top of my screen was a live broadcast notification. It was from Brittany. The bright pink ring glowed around her profile picture. Confused, I tapped the icon. The video loaded instantly, and the sounds of loud laughter and clinking glasses filled the silent dining room. I scrambled to turn the volume down on my phone, my hands suddenly shaking. On the screen, Brittany was holding her camera high in the air, showing off a massive, sprawling kitchen with gleaming white marble countertops and custom cabinetry. The room was absolutely packed with people. I recognized my aunt, my uncle, my cousins, and several family friends. There had to be at least 30 people gathered around a massive kitchen island that was overflowing with catered holiday food. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The background was not our parents' house. It was a massive, brand new luxury home in the affluent suburbs. High ceilings, expensive light fixtures, and spotless hardwood floors stretched out behind the crowd. Brittany spun the camera around to show her own face. She was wearing a flawless designer outfit, her hair perfectly styled for the camera. "Welcome to our first Thanksgiving in the new house," she squealed into the microphone, reading comments from her followers as they scrolled up the screen. "We are just so blessed and so thankful for all the amazing people in our lives today." The camera panned across the room and landed directly on my parents. My mother, Patricia, was holding a glass of expensive champagne, wearing a tailored dress and a beaming smile. My father, Richard, stood next to her, laughing loudly at a joke Kevin had just made. They looked completely relaxed, completely joyful, and completely unbothered by the fact that their eldest daughter was sitting alone in a restaurant waiting for them. I watched, paralyzed, as my mother stepped into the center of the camera frame. She raised her champagne glass high to quiet the room. Everyone stopped talking and turned toward her. Even through the small screen of my phone, I could see the absolute pride radiating from her face. "I want to propose a toast," my mother announced, her voice carrying clearly through the speaker. "To my successful, beautiful daughter Brittany and her incredible new home. Richard and I could not be more proud of the life you and Kevin are building. You bring so much joy to this family, and hosting Thanksgiving in this stunning estate is just the beginning of your beautiful future. Cheers to Brittany." The entire room erupted in cheers and applause. Glasses clinked together. Brittany turned the camera back to herself, blowing a kiss to her followers and pretending to wipe away a happy tear. I sat alone in the private dining room, the air suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. The betrayal hit me with the force of a physical blow. This was not a mix-up. This was not a scheduling error. This was a deliberate, coordinated boycott of my dinner. Every single person in that video had received an invitation to my celebration. Every single one of them had RSVP'd yes to me. And yet they had all secretly conspired to abandon my dinner and gather at Brittany's new suburban mansion instead. My parents had known for months how important this day was to me. They knew I had spent thousands of dollars to celebrate my career milestone. They knew I was waiting for them. And instead of simply declining my invitation, they chose to humiliate me. They chose to let me sit in an empty restaurant staring at expensive floral arrangements, while they drank champagne and celebrated my sister. It was a calculated statement, meant to put me in my place. Meant to remind me that no matter what I achieved, no matter how hard I worked, I would never be the priority. I would never be the golden child. I would always be the daughter they could comfortably ignore. A hot, bitter wave of tears finally spilled over my eyelashes and rolled down my cheeks. I quickly wiped them away, furious with myself for crying over people who clearly did not care about me. I looked at the beautiful, uneaten food, at the sparkling crystal glasses that would remain empty. I had spent my entire life trying to be good enough for a mother and father who were entirely captivated by superficial status. I realized in that quiet, devastating moment that I could buy the most expensive dinner in the world, and it would never purchase their love. I turned my phone face down on the mahogany table, unable to watch another second of their joyful broadcast. The silence of the private dining room settled heavily around me once again. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to compose myself so I could call the manager over and pay the bill for the empty party. I felt entirely defeated, completely broken by the sheer cruelty of my own blood relatives. But just as I was reaching for my purse to retrieve my credit card, I heard the heavy wooden doors of the private dining room unlatch. The brass handles clicked, and the doors slowly swung open. I looked up, expecting to see a waiter coming to clear the untouched plates. Instead, I saw a familiar figure standing in the doorway, her posture rigid and her eyes blazing with an intensity that commanded immediate respect. It was not my parents. It was my grandmother. Grandma Martha wore a sharp charcoal pantsuit, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and pinned back. She walked with the steady, measured pace of a woman who owned every room she entered. She did not look at the extravagant floral arrangements or the untouched prime rib resting on the silver serving carts. Her piercing blue eyes locked directly onto my tear-stained face. I quickly grabbed my white linen napkin and dabbed at my cheeks, trying to salvage whatever dignity I had left. I opened my mouth to explain the situation, to make some pathetic excuse about a scheduling mix-up, but Martha raised a single-gloved hand, silencing me instantly. She pulled out a heavy oak chair opposite mine and sat down. She did not offer me a sympathetic hug. She did not murmur sweet platitudes about how terrible my parents were or how sorry she felt for me. Martha had never been the comforting type. She was a woman of logic, raw facts, and immediate action. She reached into her structured leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. She tossed it across the table. It landed with a heavy thud against the polished mahogany, stopping just inches from my empty crystal water glass. "Stop crying over people who are robbing you blind," she said, her voice sharp and steady, echoing in the quiet dining room. "Open it." I stared at the envelope. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. As a financial auditor, I spent my life looking at documents. I could spot a discrepancy in a complex corporate tax return from a mile away. I was trained to find hidden liabilities and track missing assets. But my hands trembled uncontrollably as I reached out and unfastened the metal clasp of the folder my grandmother had compiled. I pulled out a massive stack of papers printed on thick legal stock. The first document was a property deed and a closing disclosure form. I recognized the address immediately. It was the exact same suburban street address Brittany had tagged in her social media broadcast just moments ago. The sprawling McMansion, where my entire extended family was currently eating Thanksgiving dinner. I flipped to the next page, which was a detailed mortgage agreement from a major national bank. The principal loan amount was listed clearly at the top in bold black ink. $1.2 million. I scanned the borrower section, expecting to see my father, Richard, and my mother, Patricia, listed alongside Brittany and her husband, Kevin. I saw my parents' names clearly printed. But right beneath my father's signature was another name that made my blood run entirely cold. My name. Elise Marie Anderson. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dim lighting of the restaurant. I traced my finger over the ink. Right next to my printed name was my personal social security number, my exact date of birth, and a signature that looked remarkably like mine, but was just slightly off. The loops were too perfectly practiced. The pressure of the pen was too even. It was a masterful forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. My parents had not just bought a luxury house for their golden child. They had used my spotless financial history, my perfect credit score, and my identity to co-sign a $1.2 million mortgage. They had committed egregious identity theft. I had spent the last 5 years living incredibly frugally. I carefully saved my corporate bonuses, built an impeccable credit profile, and denied myself vacations just to achieve financial stability. I was scheduled to close on a modest two-bedroom condo next month. It was going to be my very first home, an achievement I had worked tirelessly to secure. The bank had already pre-approved me based on my flawless debt-to-income ratio. But with a $1.2 million liability suddenly attached to my Social Security number, my debt-to-income ratio was completely obliterated. My mortgage application for my own modest home would be automatically flagged and denied by the underwriters. My parents had deliberately ruined my financial future just so Brittany could host Thanksgiving in a house she absolutely could not afford. Keep reading. Martha commanded, her eyes locked intensely on my face, watching the realization hit me. They did not just borrow your credit score, Elise. They took your cash. I set the forged mortgage documents aside, my hands now completely steady. The profound sadness that had gripped me only minutes ago was rapidly evaporating, replaced by a clinical, icy focus. The next stack of papers consisted of certified bank statements from an account I barely remembered. It was an educational and establishment trust set up by my late grandfather Martha's husband. When he passed away 15 years ago, my parents had explicitly told me the trust had been completely depleted to pay for his end-of-life medical expenses. They had looked me in the eye and told me there was nothing left, which was exactly why I had been forced to take out massive high-interest student loans to pay for my accounting degree. I looked at the balance on the first statement dated 2 years ago. $200,000. The money had been there the entire time, sitting quietly in a secure account and accumulating interest. I turned to the transaction logs, using my trained auditor eyes to trace the outflow of funds over the past 18 months. The account had not been drained by medical bills or stock market crashes. It had been systematically bled dry through dozens of authorized wire transfers. I tracked the routing numbers to the destination accounts listed on the next page. Every single wire transfer had been sent directly to a limited liability company registered in Delaware. The registered agent for the holding company was Kevin, my sister's husband. Kevin was a notorious failure. He spent his days browsing internet forums and calling himself a cryptocurrency investor. He was always pitching new digital coins and obscure blockchain schemes, promising exponential returns to anyone foolish enough to listen. My parents had always praised his bold entrepreneurial spirit, while actively mocking my steady corporate accounting job. Now I was holding the exact irrefutable proof of how his lavish lifestyle was actually funded. My parents had illegally accessed my grandfather's trust, overriding the banking security protocols by claiming I had authorized the withdrawals. They had stolen $200,000 of my money. The money meant to launch my adult life and pay for my education had been handed directly to Kevin to burn on useless internet tokens and high-risk crypto ventures. While I was eating instant noodles in my college dormitory and working late-night shifts to pay off my suffocating student debt, my family was quietly siphoning my inheritance. While they mocked me for driving a sensible used car and living in a basic apartment, they were using my stolen wealth to maintain their facade of luxury. The expensive country club memberships, the designer clothes, the brand new suburban mansion. It was all built entirely on a foundation of my stolen identity and my grandfather's hijacked money. I placed the documents flat on the table and aligned the edges perfectly. The soft jazz music still played from the hidden speakers. The beautiful prime rib and roasted turkey sat untouched on the silver serving carts, filling the room with the scent of a holiday I was no longer celebrating. But I no longer felt the sting of rejection. I no longer felt like the unloved daughter desperate for a single seat at their table. I felt the precise, calculated energy of an auditor who had just uncovered a massive corporate fraud. Martha watched me carefully. She saw the dramatic shift in my posture. She saw my tears dry completely, leaving behind a look of absolute resolve. "They think you are weak," Martha said, her voice lowering to a harsh, commanding whisper. "They think because you always try to please them, you will just roll over and take this abuse. They think they can sacrifice your entire future to keep Brittany happy and no one will ever find out." I gathered the fraudulent mortgage agreements, the forged signature pages, and the detailed wire transfer logs. I slid them methodically back into the heavy manila envelope and sealed the metal clasp shut. "They made a very bad calculation," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. You do not commit federal wire fraud and identity theft against a financial auditor. I stood up from the empty table and grabbed my coat. I did not need to eat the extravagant meal I had purchased. I needed to work. The drive from downtown Chicago to the affluent northern suburbs took exactly 47 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I drove in complete silence with the heater blasting against the freezing November chill. The thick manila envelope rested on the passenger seat next to my purse. With every mile marker that passed my mind organized the newly discovered data. I categorized the betrayals the exact same way I would categorize fraudulent ledger entries during a corporate audit. Emotions were messy and unpredictable, but numbers were absolute. They had stolen my identity. They had drained my grandfather's trust fund. They had jeopardized my entire financial future. And they were currently toasting to their own brilliance with champagne bought on my credit. I pulled into the sprawling neighborhood of pristine manicured lawns and oversized custom-built houses. Brittany's new address was incredibly easy to spot. Luxury cars lined both sides of the street, and the massive circular driveway was packed bumper to bumper with vehicles belonging to my aunts, uncles, and cousins. The house itself was a monstrosity of modern suburban excess. Huge white columns flanked the double front doors. Massive bay windows showcased the warm, glowing lights, and the massive crowd gathered inside. I parked my modest sedan right behind Kevin's brand new imported sports car. I grabbed the heavy manila envelope and stepped out into the biting winter air. The cold wind stung my cheeks, but it felt incredibly good. It kept me sharp. I walked up the paved stone pathway, listening to the muffled sounds of holiday music and booming laughter escaping through the glass panes. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I simply grabbed the heavy brass handle and pushed the front doors wide open. The entryway was paved in expensive imported white marble. To my left, a massive formal dining room overflowed with seated guests. To my right, the open concept kitchen was filled with catered silver trays and towering floral arrangements that rivaled the ones I had purchased for my own empty dinner. The sheer volume of laughter and overlapping conversations was deafening. I took slow, deliberate steps into the center of the living space. My dark winter coat and severe expression sharply contrasted with the bright, festive holiday attire everyone else was wearing. It took about 10 seconds for someone to actually notice me standing there. My Aunt Susan was the first to stop talking. She lowered her wineglass and stared at me with wide eyes. Slowly, the silence rippled outward like a wave moving across a dark pond. One by one, my extended relatives turned their heads. The boisterous laughter died completely in their throats. The clinking of expensive silverware ceased. The festive jazz music playing from the ceiling speakers suddenly sounded inappropriately loud in the dead quiet room. I found my parents standing near the massive kitchen island. My father Richard had a plate piled high with carved turkey and truffles. When he saw me, the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a man who had just seen a ghost. His jaw literally dropped open. My mother Patricia was holding a crystal champagne flute. Her hand began to tremble so violently that a few drops of the expensive alcohol spilled over the rim and splashed onto the pristine marble countertop. But my mother was a master of social survival. She had spent decades perfecting the art of saving face in front of her country club friends and judging relatives. It took her exactly 3 seconds to recover her composure, hide her terror, and launch into her heavily practiced offensive strategy. She slammed her champagne glass down and rushed toward me with her arms outstretched, faking an expression of deep maternal concern. "Elise, my goodness," she gasped loudly, ensuring every single person in the massive room could hear her. "You gave us such a terrible fright walking in like that, looking so distressed. I thought you were working at the office today." She reached out to grab my shoulders, but I took one precise step backward. Her hands grasped empty air. She smoothly transitioned her awkward stumble into a dramatic sigh of pity. She turned to the crowd of relatives, giving them a sad, knowing look. "I told everyone you might be having another one of your episodes," she announced, projecting her voice perfectly so it bounced off the vaulted ceilings. You are manic again, Elise. I can see it in your eyes. You are working yourself into an absolute frenzy at that accounting firm, and it is making you completely unstable. The relatives began to murmur among themselves. I watched them exchange sympathetic glances with my mother. She had clearly laid the groundwork for this lie long before I arrived. She had painted me as the unstable workaholic who could not be bothered to show up for family events. We told you this was just a casual gathering, she continued, her voice dripping with toxic fake sympathy. We knew your work schedule was too demanding to host that big fancy dinner downtown. We tried to save you the stress. We texted you, honey. Did you forget to check your phone again? The sheer audacity of her lie was breathtaking. She was standing in a $1.2 million house bought with my stolen social security number, pretending she had abandoned my $4,000 dinner out of maternal concern for my mental health. She stepped closer and lowered her voice to a harsh, threatening whisper meant only for me. Do not make a scene here, Elise. Go wait in the guest bedroom right now before you embarrass yourself further. Before I could respond, my sister Brittany pushed her way through the crowd of stunned relatives. She was wearing a sparkling cocktail dress that looked wildly out of place for a family Thanksgiving. She crossed her arms over her chest and glared at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. Her golden child status gave her a false sense of absolute invincibility. Why are you here, Elise? Brittany snapped, tossing her long blonde hair over her shoulder. You always do this. You always have to ruin my special moments. I looked at Brittany, completely unfazed by her hostility. I held the heavy manila envelope casually at my side. I did not raise my voice. I did not frown. I simply stared at her with the cold, dead eyes of an auditor looking at a fraudulent spreadsheet. My calm, quiet demeanor seemed to infuriate her even more. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. You are just obsessed and jealous, Brittany shouted, her voice shrill and echoing through the kitchen. You have been jealous of me our entire lives. You are mad because I have a beautiful husband and a gorgeous new house, and you have absolutely nothing but your boring corporate job. You could not stand the fact that everyone wanted to come celebrate my new mansion instead of going to your stupid stuffy dinner. So you had to show up here looking like a crazy person to try and steal my spotlight on my big day. Kevin stepped up behind his wife, placing a protective hand on Brittany's waist. He puffed out his chest, trying to look physically intimidating. Look, Elise, he said, using his best fake entrepreneur voice. We do not want any bad vibes in our new home. We are all about positive energy here. You need to leave right now before I have to physically remove you from my property. My property. The words echoed in my mind. He was claiming ownership of a property secured entirely by my clean credit history and funded by my stolen inheritance. I looked around the room, taking in the faces of my audience. My Aunt Susan was shaking her head in disappointment, clearly believing my mother's lies about my mental state. My Uncle John was looking at me with deep pity. My younger cousins were whispering to each other, clearly enjoying the dramatic entertainment I had provided. My mother stood tall, looking tragically victimized, wiping a fake tear from her eye. My father remained frozen near the kitchen island, too cowardly to speak, clutching his plate of food like a shield. They all thought they had won. They all thought they had successfully painted me into a corner where any reaction would only prove their point. If I yelled, I was manic. If I cried, I was unstable. If I argued, I was jealous. So I did none of those things. I let them dig their graves deeper. I stood in absolute silence for a full 60 seconds, letting the tension build until it became physically suffocating. I wanted every single person in that room to clearly remember exactly what Patricia, Brittany, and Kevin had just said. I wanted them to remember the immense arrogance, the cruel insults, and the blatant gaslighting. I wanted the contrast between their vicious emotional attacks and my total composure to be permanently burned into their memories. The silence stretched on, becoming unbearable for the crowd. Brittany shifted uncomfortably, shifting her weight from one designer heel to the other. Kevin dropped his intimidating posture and looked nervously at Richard. Even my mother's fake tragic expression began to falter as she stared at the thick manila envelope resting quietly in my hand. They had handed me the perfect setup. By attacking me so viciously and publicly, they had ensured that their own impending downfall would be equally public. I looked directly into my father's terrified eyes, waiting for the absolute perfect moment to strike. I smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm expression. I broke the stifling silence with a voice so steady it commanded absolute attention. Congratulations on the new house, Brittany. It truly is a stunning property. The open concept kitchen is gorgeous, and the marble countertops are a wonderful touch. You and Kevin must be incredibly proud of yourselves. Brittany blinked, her aggressive posture faltering for a fraction of a second. She exchanged a confused glance with her husband. Patricia's mouth tightened into a hard line, unsure of where I was going with this sudden pivot to politeness. I did not wait for them to respond. I unclasped the metal fastener of my manila envelope. I reached inside and pulled out the single sheet of thick paper I had prepared specifically for this moment. It was a high-quality color copy of the final signature page from the mortgage closing disclosure. I stepped past my sister, ignoring her completely, and walked directly toward the kitchen island where my father stood paralyzed. I placed the document face up right next to his plate of carved turkey. I brought a housewarming gift, I announced. Richard looked down at the paper. I watched his eyes track across the printed text. I saw the exact second his brain registered the forged signature, my social security number, and the official bank seal at the bottom of the page. The color drained from his face so rapidly, he looked as though he might physically collapse. The expensive crystal plate in his hand rattled against the marble countertop as his fingers lost their grip. "What is that?" Patricia demanded, her voice shrill. She rushed over to my father's side and snatched the paper from the counter. I turned to face my audience. Aunt Susan, Uncle John, and the sea of extended relatives were watching this exchange with breathless anticipation. They had expected a screaming match. They had expected a manic breakdown. Instead, they were watching a junior partner at a financial auditing firm execute a flawless corporate takedown in the middle of their holiday feast. That I said, projecting my voice so it reached every corner of the massive open-concept living space, is the closing disclosure for the $1.2 million mortgage on this beautiful new house. I thought everyone here celebrating Brittany and Kevin's massive success should know exactly how this property was funded. Because Kevin did not buy this house with his brilliant cryptocurrency investments, and my parents did not buy it with their country club wealth. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the faces of my aunts and uncles. This house was purchased using my stolen social security number. My parents forged my signature to co-sign the loan because their own credit is completely ruined and Kevin does not have a legitimate income. They committed federal identity theft to finance my sister's suburban mansion. The entire room erupted into a symphony of shocked gasps. Aunt Susan covered her mouth with both hands. Uncle John took a step forward, his brow furrowed in deep disbelief. "That is a lie," Patricia screamed, clutching the paper to her chest. Her face was flushed dark red with panic. "She is lying. She forged this document herself because she is deeply unwell. Richard, tell them she is lying." Richard could not speak. He stood frozen, staring at the floor, sweat beading on his forehead. His silence was the loudest confession anyone in the room could have asked for. "I am an auditor, Mother," I replied, my tone brutally clinical. "I do not forge documents. I find the people who do. And I found much more than just a fraudulent mortgage." I reached into the envelope again and pulled out the certified bank records, showing the wire transfers from my grandfather's trust. I did not hand these to my parents. I handed them directly to Uncle John, the man who had been named the executor of my grandfather's estate 15 years ago. "Uncle John!" I said, my voice cutting through Patricia's frantic protests. "You might want to review these wire transfer logs. They show exactly what happened to the $200,000 educational trust grandfather left for me. My parents told everyone the money was lost to medical bills. The truth is, they systematically drained the account over the past 18 months. They wired every single penny of my inheritance to a shell company registered in Delaware." I turned my head and locked eyes with my brother-in-law. Kevin was practically shrinking behind Brittany, his fake tough guy persona completely shattered. A shell company owned entirely by Kevin, I concluded. Uncle John scanned the banking documents. He was a retired banker himself, and he understood exactly what he was looking at. He looked up from the papers, his face twisting in absolute disgust. He turned his glare toward my father. Richard, Uncle John growled, "Tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you did not steal your own daughter's inheritance to fund this idiot's fake businesses." "It was a loan," Richard stammered weakly, his voice cracking. "It was just a temporary bridge loan to help Kevin get his company off the ground. We were going to pay Elise back with interest once the crypto markets rebounded. We just needed a little more time." His admission destroyed the final remaining shred of my mother's gaslighting campaign. She could no longer pretend I was manic. She could no longer claim the documents were fake. Her own husband had just confessed to massive financial theft in front of the entire extended family. Brittany stared at her husband in horror. For all her narcissism and entitlement, she apparently had no idea about the depth of the crimes committed to maintain her lifestyle. "Kevin," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is she talking about? Where did the money for the house come from?" Kevin could not look his wife in the eye. He stared at his expensive designer shoes, his silence confirming everything I had just exposed. Patricia tried one last desperate maneuver. She dropped the forged signature page on the counter and took a step toward me, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Elise, honey, please," she begged, abandoning her hostile tone for a pathetic pleading whimper. "We are family. We can fix this. We can sit down right now in the other room and work out a repayment plan. You do not need to do this in front of everyone. Please do not ruin Thanksgiving." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, insignificant, and unloved. I looked at the mother who had abandoned my celebration dinner downtown to mock me on a live broadcast. There was no pity left in my heart. There was only the cold, hard reality of the numbers. "You ruined Thanksgiving the moment you decided to steal my identity and skip my dinner to celebrate your fraud," I said firmly. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder. I had delivered the data. I had presented the evidence. My audit of this family was complete. The illusion of the wealthy, successful golden child and her generous parents was permanently shattered. They were exposed as common thieves hiding behind designer clothes and catered food. I turned to look at my father one final time. He looked pathetic, a hollow shell of the arrogant man who used to mock my sensible career choices. "I hope the turkey is good, Dad," I said, delivering my final statement with lethal precision. "Because Monday morning at 9 o'clock sharp, I am walking into the federal building downtown. I am reporting the identity theft, the unauthorized wire transfers, and the mortgage fraud directly to the IRS and the FBI." Patricia let out a strangled, terrified sob. Richard closed his eyes as if bracing for an impact that had already hit. I did not wait for their excuses. I did not stay to watch them beg. I turned around and walked back through the grand entryway of the fraudulent mansion. The heavy silence of the room followed me all the way to the door. Not a single relative tried to stop me. Uncle John was already shouting at my father as I grabbed the brass handle. Aunt Susan was consoling a weeping Brittany. The perfect holiday gathering had descended into absolute chaos. I walked out into the freezing November air and let the heavy double doors slam shut behind me. The crisp wind hit my face, refreshing and clean. I walked down the stone path to my car, my posture perfectly straight. The heavy manila envelope was significantly lighter now, but its impact was monumental. I got into my reliable sedan and started the engine. As I pulled out of the crowded driveway, I looked in my rearview mirror. The glowing lights of the mansion no longer looked intimidating or impressive. They just looked like a crime scene waiting to be processed. I drove away from the suburbs, leaving my parents paralyzed with terror and my extended family whispering about their devastating downfall. The first major domino of conflict had officially fallen. But I knew my parents would not just surrender. Cornered animals were always the most dangerous. They would try to destroy me before Monday morning arrived. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, ready for whatever retaliation they were planning. I had the truth on my side, and in the world of auditing, the truth always wins. The highway stretched out before me, illuminated by the harsh orange glow of streetlights. My phone sitting in the cup holder began to buzz incessantly. The caller ID flashed with incoming calls from Patricia, then Richard, then Brittany. I did not answer a single one. I simply reached over and powered the device down, plunging the car cabin back into peaceful, uninterrupted silence. They were panicking. They were scrambling to find a way to silence me, to coerce me into signing a retroactive approval for the mortgage, or to accept a worthless promissory note for the stolen trust funds. They thought they could still manipulate the situation, using the same old family guilt tactics they had employed for 3 decades. But they failed to understand that the daughter they had abused was gone. I was no longer the eager-to-please scapegoat. I was a professional who dealt in federal regulations, compliance standards, and criminal financial liability. I knew Patricia's mind was currently racing through her Rolodex of connections, trying to find a way to discredit my findings. If she could not convince me to drop the charges, her only remaining option would be to destroy my credibility completely. She would need to make sure that when I walked into the federal building on Monday morning, no one would believe a word I said. I accelerated down the highway, my mind shifting into defensive preparation. The financial audit was finished, but the war for my reputation was just beginning. I needed to anticipate her defensive strategy. I needed to prepare for the inevitable character assassination. As the Chicago skyline came into view, shining brilliantly against the dark night sky, I felt a surge of absolute readiness. The holiday was over, and the battle lines were permanently drawn. Friday morning arrived with a biting frost that coated the windows of my apartment. I had not slept a single minute. Instead, I had spent the entire night transforming my dining room table into a makeshift war room. The forged mortgage documents, the wire transfer logs, and the property deeds were all meticulously organized into categorized folders. I scanned every single page, creating redundant encrypted digital backups on 3 separate external hard drives. I drafted the official reporting forms for the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, ensuring every assertion was backed by a corresponding piece of hard financial data. I was operating on pure adrenaline and the cold comfort of undeniable facts. Yet as the morning stretched into the early afternoon, an unsettling quiet settled over my apartment. My phone remained completely silent. There were no frantic text messages from my mother. There were no threatening voicemails from Kevin. The panicked barrage of calls that had flooded my phone during the drive back to Chicago had completely ceased. In the world of financial auditing, complete silence from a guilty party never means they have surrendered. It means they are destroying the paper trail. Or worse, it means they have found a way to destroy the auditor. I decided to log into my corporate network to clear my inbox before the weekend officially began. I sat down at my home office desk and opened my firm-issued laptop. I entered my credentials and waited for the secure virtual private network to connect. Instead of the familiar blue loading screen, a harsh red error message flashed across my monitor: "Access denied. Contact system administrator." I frowned, tapping the keys to refresh the connection. The error message remained. I reached for my personal cell phone to check my synchronized corporate email application. As I unlocked the screen, I watched in real time as the mail application force closed itself. The icon turned gray and vanished from my home screen. The firm had initiated a remote data wipe protocol. My corporate access had been entirely severed. A cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. The remote wipe protocol was a drastic security measure strictly reserved for employees who were being terminated for cause or who posed an immediate existential threat to client data. Before I could process the terrifying implications, my personal phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed the name Arthur Harrison. He was the senior managing partner at my auditing firm, the exact man who had personally approved my promotion to junior partner just 2 weeks prior. I answered the call, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison. I seem to be experiencing a network lockout." There was a heavy, uncomfortable silence on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual booming warmth. It was tight, formal, and layered with deep concern. "Elise," he began, sounding incredibly strained. "I have Linda from Human Resources on the line with us. I need to inform you that effective immediately, you are being placed on mandatory administrative leave pending a full internal investigation." I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on the encrypted hard drives resting on my table. On what grounds? I asked, my tone remaining completely clinical. Mr. Harrison let out a heavy sigh. Elise. I received a very disturbing phone call this morning at my private residence. It was from your mother, Patricia. She managed to get my personal number through a mutual contact at her country club. She called me in a state of absolute distress. She was weeping inconsolably. I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer malicious brilliance of my mother's preemptive strike. Patricia knew she could not alter the bank records. She knew she could not erase the forged mortgage documents, so she had decided to completely annihilate the credibility of the person holding the evidence. What exactly did my mother say to you, Mr. Harrison? I asked, refusing to let my voice shake. Linda from Human Resources chimed in, her tone dripping with bureaucratic caution. Elise, your mother informed us that you suffered a severe psychiatric break yesterday during a family holiday gathering. She claimed you burst into your sister's home, behaving erratically and aggressively toward your extended family. Mr. Harrison took over, his voice thick with pity that made my skin crawl. Elise, your mother told us you have a hidden history of severe mental instability. She said you waved a stack of fabricated financial documents at your father and threatened to blackmail the family for $1 million. She warned us that you have a dangerous obsession with forging signatures and creating fake bank records to extort people who upset you. The audacity of the lie was staggering. Patricia had taken her own exact crimes, the forgery, the extortion, the financial manipulation, and projected them entirely onto me. She had weaponized my career against me. She called you to warn the firm, I stated, summarizing their panicked logic. She told you that a deranged junior partner with a history of fabricating financial documents currently has unrestricted access to the sensitive tax returns and corporate portfolios of your wealthiest clients. Yes, Elise, Linda confirmed, her voice tight. Your mother said she was terrified of what you might do to the firm's clients if you were experiencing a manic episode. She said she felt a moral obligation to protect the firm from your erratic behavior. Given the nature of our industry and the extreme sensitivity of the data you handle, we had no choice but to initiate an immediate security lockout. We simply cannot risk a compromised auditor handling client funds. It was the perfect corporate assassination. In the financial sector, an auditor's entire career is built on a foundation of absolute, unshakable integrity. We are the gatekeepers of the truth. If an auditor is even suspected of forging documents or suffering from a break with reality, their career is instantly dead. No client would ever trust them again. No firm would ever employ them. Patricia knew exactly what buttons to push to trigger an immediate panic at the executive level. They expected me to scream. They expected me to cry and beg for my job. They expected me to launch into a hysterical rant about my evil parents stealing my identity, which would unfortunately sound exactly like the manic, paranoid delusions my mother had just warned them about. Patricia had designed a trap where any emotional reaction from me would only serve as absolute proof of her lies. So I gave them nothing. Mr. Harrison, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, measured cadence that carried absolute authority. I completely understand the firm's position. You have a fiduciary duty to protect client data from any potential liability. You followed the exact protocol I would have followed if I were in your position. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. My total lack of hysteria clearly caught them off guard. However, I continued, speaking slowly and deliberately. I need you to understand exactly what is happening here. I did not have a psychiatric break. I did not attempt to extort my family. My parents recently committed massive federal identity theft, using my social security number to secure $1 million mortgage. I confronted them with the irrefutable proof yesterday afternoon. They are currently terrified that I am going to the federal authorities on Monday morning. Your phone call from my weeping mother was a calculated, preemptive strike designed to destroy my professional credibility before I can file a formal police report. Elise, Mr. Harrison said, his tone shifting from pity to uncertainty. These are incredibly serious accusations you are making against your own parents. Yes, they are, I agreed smoothly. And unlike my mother, I have the certified bank records to prove every single word I just said. I will cooperate fully with your internal human resources investigation. I will provide whatever documentation the firm requires to clear my name, but please be aware that by Tuesday morning, my parents will be the subjects of a federal fraud investigation. I strongly advise the firm's legal counsel to prepare for subpoenas regarding my mother's defamatory phone call to you this morning. I did not wait for them to respond. I politely wished them a good weekend and disconnected the call. I set my phone down on the desk and stared at the blank screen of my locked corporate laptop. Patricia had drawn first blood. She had successfully orchestrated my suspension from the firm I had sacrificed my youth to climb. She had cut off my income, my professional identity, and my daily purpose with a single phone call. She wanted me to feel the same crushing, helpless terror that Richard had felt standing in that kitchen. She wanted me to panic and negotiate. She wanted me to realize that she could destroy my life just as easily as I could destroy hers. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long, slow breath. My parents were playing a desperate game of mutually assured destruction. If they could successfully paint me as a mentally unstable blackmailer, it would seriously complicate my federal reports. The authorities would have to waste valuable time untangling a messy domestic dispute, giving Richard and Kevin exactly what they needed: time. Time to move the stolen trust funds offshore. Time to hide the assets. Time to cover their tracks. I realized with chilling clarity that taking the documents to the authorities on Monday would no longer be enough. Submitting a police report would trigger a quiet behind-closed-doors investigation that could take years to yield an indictment. By then, my reputation would be in ashes, and my career would be a distant memory. Patricia and Richard did not fight fair. They used public humiliation, social sabotage, and vicious character assassination. They fought in the mud. I needed to adapt my strategy immediately. If my mother wanted to use her social connections to destroy my life, I would have to completely obliterate her social standing before she could utter another lie. I needed to ensure that when the federal agents finally knocked on her door, she had absolutely nowhere left to hide and no one left to believe her. The silence of my apartment felt different now. It was not the silence of an abandoned daughter. It was the quiet focus of a professional who was preparing to burn a fraudulent empire straight to the ground. Patricia had made a catastrophic error. She thought suspending me from my job would break my spirit. Instead, she had just cleared my entire schedule. I now had absolutely nothing to do but dedicate every waking hour to dismantling her entire life. Monday morning arrived with the dull thud of a certified envelope hitting my front door. The courier required my physical signature. I signed the electronic pad and carried the heavy cardboard mailer to my kitchen table. Inside was the official documentation from Human Resources. It was printed on the firm's heavy watermarked letterhead. The language was cold, absolute, and legally impenetrable. I was officially suspended without pay, effective immediately. The letter cited a potential violation of the firm's moral turpitude clause and mandated a full psychiatric evaluation before I could even petition to return to the building. I was explicitly forbidden from contacting any clients, accessing any corporate systems, or speaking to any of my colleagues. I set the letter down next to the forged mortgage documents. My career was hanging by a single fraying thread. I had spent 7 years sacrificing my holidays, my weekends, and my 20s to climb the corporate ladder. I had missed weddings and birthdays to ensure my client portfolios were perfectly balanced. Now all of that dedication had been wiped out by a single malicious phone call from a woman desperate to hide her own financial crimes. I walked into my kitchen to pour a cup of black coffee. The silence in my apartment was absolute. I was entirely cut off from the professional world that had defined my entire adult identity. But the silence did not last long. My personal cell phone resting on the granite countertop began to vibrate. Then it vibrated again. Within 10 seconds, the device was shaking continuously, emitting a relentless, rapid-fire sequence of notification chimes. I frowned and picked up the phone. I expected to see emails from the firm, or perhaps a gloating text message from my father. Instead, I saw a tidal wave of social media alerts. My lock screen was completely overwhelmed with notifications from Instagram. Hundreds of them were pouring in every single minute. I opened the application and my heart dropped into my stomach. I had been tagged in a video by Brittany. My sister possessed a verified account with over 500,000 followers. She had built a lucrative brand portraying herself as the ultimate relatable lifestyle guru. Her followers hung on her every word, buying the skincare products she recommended and replicating the aesthetic of her seemingly perfect suburban life. Now she had weaponized that massive digital army and aimed it directly at me. I tapped on the video to play it. Brittany was not wearing her usual flawless makeup or designer clothing. She was sitting on the floor of a large empty room in her new fraudulent mansion. She was wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt, her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun. The lighting was deliberately dim and moody. She was staring directly into the camera lens with large, tear-filled eyes. It was a masterclass in digital manipulation. "Hey guys," Brittany began, her voice trembling perfectly. She let out a shaky breath and wiped a tear from her cheek. "I never usually bring my personal family drama onto this platform because I want this page to be a positive, safe space for all of you. But I am terrified right now, and I need to speak my truth." I watched in absolute disgust as my sister delivered the performance of a lifetime. "For years, my family has been dealing with a very dark secret." Brittany continued, staring mournfully into the lens. "My older sister Elise has struggled with severe mental health issues and toxic jealousy. My parents have tried everything to help her. They paid for her treatments. They supported her when she pushed everyone else away. But she has always resented me. She has always hated seeing me happy." She paused, letting a fresh wave of tears spill over her eyelashes. She hugged her knees to her chest, looking incredibly small and vulnerable. "Yesterday, we were hosting a beautiful, peaceful Thanksgiving dinner in our new home. We saved for years to buy this house. We worked so hard, but Elise burst through our front door having a complete manic episode. She started screaming at our parents. She threw fabricated legal documents at my father, and now she is threatening to file frivolous, malicious lawsuits against us to seize our house and make Kevin and me homeless right before Christmas. She wants to destroy everything we have built just because she is miserable in her own life." The sheer psychological violence of the video left me breathless. She did not just lie. She took the reality of my success, the reality of my spotless financial record, and twisted it into a narrative of bitter jealousy. She portrayed herself as the hardworking victim while openly mocking my corporate career. "I beg you guys," Brittany sniffled, looking directly at the camera. "Please send positive thoughts to my parents. They are completely heartbroken." They had to call her employer to warn them about her mental state because she handles sensitive financial data, and they were terrified she might hurt innocent people. "I just want my sister to get the psychiatric help she desperately needs so my family can be safe again." The video ended. I looked at the engagement metrics. It had been posted less than an hour ago, and it already had 200,000 views. The comment section was a horrifying display of mob mentality. I scrolled through the thousands of replies. Her followers were rabid. They were entirely captivated by the tearful performance of their favorite influencer. They bought every single word of the lie without a second of hesitation. "Your sister is a toxic sociopath," one user wrote. "You need to get a restraining order immediately." Another comment read, "It is so brave of you to share this, Brittany. Cut that jealous hag out of your life. Protect your peace." The vitriol did not stop in the public comment section. I opened my direct messages. My inbox was overflowing with hundreds of hateful messages from total strangers. People from across the country were sending me vicious paragraphs, calling me a monster, an extortionist, and a bitter corporate spinster. Some of the messages contained explicit threats of physical violence, warning me to back off and leave my pregnant sister alone. I realized with a sick jolt that Brittany had deliberately implied she might be expecting a child just to increase the emotional leverage of her video. She was willing to exploit hypothetical children to protect her stolen money. But the social exile went far beyond personal insults. Brittany's followers were organized and ruthless. A group of them had quickly tracked down my professional information. They found my profile on a business networking site and immediately started flooding the page with harassment. "Do not ever hire this woman," they commented on my professional posts. "She is a criminal who extorts her own family. She forges legal documents to make her sister homeless. She is mentally unstable." The digital mob quickly discovered the name of my auditing firm. They coordinated a mass attack on the firm's public review pages. Within minutes, the firm's overall rating plummeted as hundreds of Britney's followers left one-star reviews, citing my name specifically. They demanded that the firm terminate the deranged extortionist immediately or face a massive public boycott. Now the phone call from Mr. Harrison made perfect sense. Patricia had called him on Friday to plant the seed of doubt. But the firm's real panic was driven by this explosive public relations nightmare. The firm could not afford to be associated with a viral scandal. They needed to cut ties with me instantly to protect their corporate image. My mother and sister had successfully orchestrated a coordinated strike from two different angles. Patricia handled the corporate executives, and Brittany handled the court of public opinion. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter, feeling a suffocating weight pressed down on my chest. I was entirely isolated. I could not go to the office. I could not call my colleagues. My reputation, which had been spotless just 48 hours ago, was now being dragged through the mud by 500,000 strangers on the internet. My parents had effectively trapped me in my own apartment. If I went to the police now, I would look exactly like the unstable, vindictive sibling Brittany had warned her followers about. Any federal agent who Googled my name would immediately see thousands of people claiming I was a disgruntled manic extortionist. The brilliance of their strategy was undeniable. They had neutralized me. They had erected a massive digital wall between me and the authorities. I paced across my living room, running my hands through my hair. I felt a fleeting moment of genuine despair. How could a single auditor fight an entire army of devoted internet followers? How could I prove the truth when the lie was already halfway around the world? I looked at the stack of encrypted hard drives sitting on my dining table. The certified bank records, the forged property deeds, the wire transfer logs. They were cold, hard facts. They did not weep on camera. They did not require a lighting ring or a relatable gray sweatshirt to be true. I stopped pacing. The initial shock of the online harassment was fading, leaving behind a sharp, focused clarity. Brittany had just made a massive tactical error. She had felt so untouchable in her golden child status that she had decided to wage a public war against a professional forensic auditor. She had invited me into her digital domain. If she wanted to play a game of public perception, I would simply audit her entire digital footprint. She funded her luxurious influencer lifestyle using $200,000 stolen from my grandfather's trust. That meant every single designer handbag she flaunted, every lavish vacation she documented, and every sponsored post she uploaded was deeply intertwined with federal wire fraud. I walked back to my desk and opened a brand new, secure browser window. I created a dummy social media account completely untraceable to my personal information. I navigated to Brittany's page and began to meticulously archive her entire online history. I cataloged her brand deals, her promotional links, and the various funding platforms she used to monetize her audience. I was going to follow the digital money trail until I found the exact artery connecting her fake internet life to my stolen inheritance. The silence of my apartment no longer felt like isolation. It felt like a secure workspace. I was completely cut off from my day job, but I had just assigned myself a new full-time client. I was going to audit my sister's entire existence. Just as I categorized the first batch of financial data, my phone illuminated with an incoming call. The caller identification did not display a rabid follower or an angry corporate partner. It displayed the name of the only person in my family who actually understood the true nature of the enemy I was fighting. It was Grandma Martha. I answered the phone, pressing it to my ear. I expected her to ask about the viral video. I expected her to offer strategy on how to handle the firm. Instead, her voice came through the speaker tight with an entirely new level of urgency. "They just made their fatal mistake, Elise." Martha said, her tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "Stop looking at the internet. We have a much bigger problem." What happened? I asked, my hands hovering over my keyboard. Your father and your mother, Martha replied, her voice cold as steel. They just filed an emergency petition in probate court. They are trying to have me declared legally incompetent. They filed for a full conservatorship over my estate this morning. My breath caught in my throat as the sheer magnitude of their desperation finally became clear. The online smear campaign was just a distraction to keep me busy. The real war had just begun. I sat frozen in my desk chair, the phone pressed tightly against my ear. The harsh glow of my computer monitors cast long shadows across my apartment, but the chill I felt had nothing to do with the winter air outside. A conservatorship. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was the absolute nuclear option of family law. It was the legal equivalent of stripping a human being of their fundamental rights, their autonomy, and their dignity. Grandma Martha, I breathed, my mind racing to catch up with the sheer depravity of their strategy. A judge actually granted an emergency hearing for this. On what grounds? How could they possibly claim you are legally incompetent? Martha let out a sharp, humorless laugh that sounded like cracking ice. Your father is a remarkably desperate man, Elise. He submitted a sworn affidavit to the probate judge this morning. He claimed that I have been exhibiting severe signs of rapid onset dementia for the past 6 months. He cited sudden paranoia, erratic behavior, and an inability to manage my own vast financial portfolio. He even attached a fraudulent letter from a doctor at Patricia's country club who conveniently happens to owe your father a massive favor. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. The smear campaign against me on social media and the coordinated attack on my corporate career were never the ultimate endgame. They were just suppressing fire. My parents knew that destroying my reputation would not magically erase the forged mortgage documents or replace the missing $200,000 from my trust fund. They still needed raw liquid cash to cover their crimes before Monday morning. They needed a bailout, and they needed it immediately. They are going after your estate to pay off the bank, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper as the entire fraudulent schematic materialized in my head. If Richard becomes your legal conservator, he gains total unmitigated access to your stock portfolios, your liquid cash assets, and your properties. He can quietly authorize a massive withdrawal over the weekend to pay off Brittany's $1.2 million mortgage. He can replace the stolen money in my grandfather's trust fund before the federal investigators even open my file. Exactly, Martha replied, her tone vibrating with lethal precision. Your father knows that if he can wipe the financial slate clean before the authorities start knocking on doors, he can dismiss your police report as the manic ramblings of an unstable, estranged daughter. He intends to use my money to bury his crimes and then lock me away in some high-end memory care facility where no one will ever listen to a word I say. The sheer scale of their malice left me temporarily speechless. I had spent my entire life dealing with my parents' superficial narcissism and their blatant favoritism toward Brittany. I knew they were greedy. I knew they were manipulative. But this was an entirely different level of evil. They were actively plotting to institutionalize their own 78-year-old mother simply to protect a fake lifestyle influencer and a failed cryptocurrency investor from facing federal prison. They were willing to sacrifice Martha's freedom to save themselves. A new kind of anger ignited deep in my chest. It was not the sorrowful, tear-filled frustration of an unloved daughter. It was the protective, white-hot rage of a woman who had just watched her only true ally get pushed into the line of fire. My parents had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had assumed that suspending me from my auditing firm would break my spirit and leave me crying on my kitchen floor. They had assumed I would be too paralyzed by the digital mob of Brittany's followers to fight back. Instead, they had just given a highly trained forensic auditor absolutely unlimited free time and a deeply personal motive to destroy them. When is the emergency hearing? I asked, grabbing a legal pad and a pen from my desk drawer. Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, Martha answered. The judge granted an expedited preliminary hearing because Richard claimed my assets were at immediate risk of being squandered by a predatory third party. I assume he is referring to you, Elise. He is going to argue that you are trying to extort me and that he needs to step in to protect the family wealth. I wrote the date and time down on the legal pad, underlining it twice with thick black ink. They want to play dirty legal games, I said, my pen hovering over the paper. They want to weaponize the probate court. Fine. We will give them exactly what they asked for. But we are not going in there to defend your mental capacity, Martha. We are going in there to perform a public execution of Richard's financial history. Martha let out a low, approving hum. That is my brilliant girl. What do you need from me? I need total, unrestricted access to every single bank account, tax return, and investment portfolio tied to your name for the last 10 years. I instructed my mind, automatically shifting into the rigid, structured protocols of a deep dive corporate audit. If my father is desperate enough to attempt a hostile legal takeover of your entire estate to save himself today, it means he has been testing the waters for years. Thieves like Richard and Kevin do not suddenly decide to commit massive federal fraud overnight. It starts small. It starts with skimmed accounts, missing dividends, and unexplained management fees. If he has had any access to your finances since grandfather died, I guarantee you he has left a paper trail of embezzlement. I revoked his status as my financial proxy 5 years ago when I first noticed discrepancies in my quarterly dividend reports, Martha revealed, confirming my exact suspicions. But he was my primary account manager for a decade before that. I have all the physical archives stored in the fireproof filing cabinets in my home office. Hundreds of thousands of pages of raw financial data. I felt a sharp, predatory smile spread across my face. I looked at the heavy stack of documents already sitting on my dining room table. I was completely locked out of my corporate auditing firm, but I had just found the most important client of my entire career. Pack a bag, Elise, Martha commanded, her voice radiating absolute authority. The digital mob can scream on the internet all they want. We have real work to do. I am sending a private car to pick you up in 30 minutes. You are moving into my guest suite until this war is over. Bring your encrypted hard drives, your laptops, and your sharpest suits. We are going to build a fortress of evidence they cannot possibly breach. I will be ready, I promised. I disconnected the call and immediately sprang into action. The suffocating weight of the morning had completely vanished. The vicious messages flooding my phone, the corporate suspension letter, the public humiliation, they all faded into absolute insignificance. My mother and sister could have their fleeting moment of victory on social media. They could bask in the fake sympathy of their followers. It did not matter. The internet was a theater of illusions, but the probate court was an arena of sworn testimony and certified financial records. I walked into my bedroom and pulled my largest suitcase from the top shelf of my closet. I packed methodically, selecting my most severe professional attire: crisp, tailored blazers, sharply pressed trousers, and sensible heels. This was not the wardrobe of a manic, estranged sister. This was the armor of a senior auditor preparing to deliver a fatal blow to a fraudulent enterprise. I returned to the dining room and carefully loaded the encrypted hard drives into a secure lockbox. I gathered the forged mortgage documents, the wire transfer logs, and the property deeds, placing them into a waterproof briefcase. Every single piece of paper was a nail in my parents' coffin. As I zipped my luggage shut, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the hallway mirror. I looked exhausted, my eyes dark with sleeplessness, but my posture was completely rigid. I was no longer the vulnerable woman who had cried in a downtown restaurant over an empty table. The family that had abandoned me was officially dead to me. The people actively trying to destroy my life and lock my grandmother in a memory care facility were nothing more than hostile targets in a high-stakes investigation. My phone buzzed on the counter. It was a notification from the private car service Martha had dispatched. The driver was waiting downstairs. I grabbed my coat and my heavy briefcase, taking one last look around my quiet apartment. The digital mob was still raging online, entirely orchestrated by Brittany's fake tears. My firm's human resources department was likely drafting formal termination paperwork based on Patricia's malicious lies. They all thought they had successfully backed me into a corner. They thought they had buried me under a mountain of reputational damage. They did not realize they had just handed me the shovel. I walked out the front door and locked the deadbolt securely behind me. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic calm. The weekend was no longer a time for panic or despair. It was a 48-hour window to construct the most devastating forensic audit in the history of the Chicago probate court system. Richard and Patricia had demanded an emergency hearing. On Tuesday morning, I was going to give them an emergency they would never recover from. I spent the entire weekend locked inside the expansive guest suite of Martha's penthouse. The digital mob continued to rage on my muted cell phone, but their noise was entirely irrelevant now. My world had shrunk to the glowing screens of my laptops, the towering stacks of bankers' boxes Martha had hauled from her home office, and the cold, unyielding reality of numbers. I was in my element. I was an apex predator hunting in a forest of ledgers and wire transfers. Martha had provided total, unrestricted access. I had login credentials for her primary checking accounts, her high-yield savings, her diversified stock portfolios, and the various trusts she had established over her lifetime. I possessed the legal authority to view every transaction, every dividend, and every management fee assessed over the past decade. My father had served as Martha's primary financial proxy for 10 years, following my grandfather's death, until she revoked his access 5 years ago, after noticing suspicious activity. I focused my audit entirely on that critical 10-year window. I started by mapping the baseline. I established Martha's legitimate living expenses, her standard charitable donations, and her regular authorized withdrawals. This created a clear, predictable pattern of financial behavior. Once the baseline was locked, I deployed a series of automated macro scripts to scan the raw data for anomalies. I searched for irregular transfer amounts, unusual beneficiary names, and deviations in the timing of routine management fees. The software flagged the first discrepancy within 20 minutes. It was a seemingly innocuous wire transfer of $5,000 labeled as a property maintenance escrow and dated 8 years ago. I pulled the corresponding physical bank statement from Martha's archives. I traced the routing number. The destination account did not belong to a landscaping company or a property management firm. It was a private checking account registered under the name Patricia Anderson. I felt a cold thrill of discovery. I had found the thread. Now I just needed to pull it. I manually cross-referenced every single property maintenance escrow transfer over the 10-year period. There were dozens of them. They started small, 3,000 here, 5,000 there. But as the years progressed, the amounts escalated. 7,000, 10,000, 15,000. Every single transfer went directly into Patricia's private account. But Richard was not sloppy enough to rely on a single, easily traceable method. He had diversified his embezzlement strategy. I moved on to the investment portfolios. Martha held significant shares in several blue-chip tech companies. I noticed a pattern of sudden, unexplained liquidations. Small batches of stock were being sold off during periods of market volatility. The sales were always immediately followed by a capital reinvestment transfer to a secondary holding account. I spent 4 hours digging through the Delaware corporate registry to unmask the holding account. It was a limited liability company called Anderson Wealth Strategies. The sole registered officer was Richard Anderson. He was selling his mother's stock, siphoning the cash into a shell company, and classifying the theft as a reinvestment strategy. He had stolen nearly $300,000 through this method alone. The deeper I dug, the more horrific the picture became. I uncovered fraudulent consulting fees paid to Kevin's non-existent crypto startups. I found charitable donations routed to a fake nonprofit that Patricia had established to fund her expensive country club galas. I traced thousands of dollars in medical expenses that perfectly aligned with the dates of Brittany's luxury vacations to Europe and the Maldives. My father had not just skimmed a little off the top. He had treated his elderly mother's life savings like a personal ATM. He had systematically, ruthlessly embezzled nearly $2 million over a decade. He had funded Patricia's designer wardrobe, Brittany's influencer lifestyle, and Kevin's delusions of grandeur entirely with stolen money. They were not a successful, wealthy family. They were a sophisticated criminal syndicate operating under the guise of suburban affluence. By Sunday evening, my dining table was covered in highlighters, sticky notes, and printed spreadsheets. I had constructed a master timeline, a visual map of the embezzlement that was so irrefutable, so perfectly documented, that any federal prosecutor would drool over it. I had linked every stolen dollar to a specific forged document, a fake invoice, or a fraudulent shell company. I printed the final report and bound it in a thick black leather binder. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. It was the weapon that would destroy the conservatorship ambush and annihilate my parents' remaining credibility. I walked into the living room where Martha was sitting by the fireplace sipping a glass of bourbon. I handed her the binder. The physical weight of the evidence made her hands dip slightly. "I found it all," I said, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep but vibrating with triumph. $2 million, Martha. He stole $2 million from you to fund their fake lives. Martha opened the binder. She did not cry. She did not express shock or disbelief. She simply read the executive summary, her eyes moving rapidly across the precise, devastating numbers. When she finished, she closed the binder with a sharp, definitive snap. "He always was a greedy, short-sighted fool," she said softly, staring into the flickering flames. "He thought I was just an old woman who didn't understand modern banking. He thought I was an easy mark." She turned her piercing blue eyes toward me. "Tuesday morning, Elise, we walk into that courtroom and we burn him to the ground." "We won't just burn him," I corrected, a cold smile touching my lips. "We are going to make sure he never touches another dime of your money, and we are going to make sure the judge sees exactly why he filed for this conservatorship in the first place." Monday was a blur of strategic preparation. We met with Martha's probate attorney, a viciously sharp litigator named Davis. I walked him through the forensic audit, explaining the methodology, the shell companies, and the irrefutable proof of embezzlement. Davis was astounded. He had expected to fight a defensive battle proving Martha's mental competence through medical evaluations. Instead, I had handed him an offensive nuclear weapon. "They filed this conservatorship petition under the guise of protecting your assets from a manic, extorting daughter," Davis said, shaking his head in disbelief as he reviewed the wire transfer logs. "They are going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow, expecting a distressed, crying young woman and a confused elderly lady. They have absolutely no idea what is about to hit them." "Make sure they don't," I instructed. "Do not file this audit as evidence before the hearing. I want Richard to commit perjury on the stand. I want him to swear under oath that he has always acted in Martha's best financial interest. And then I want you to drop the binder on his lap." Davis grinned, a predatory flash of teeth. "Consider it done, Elise. It will be an absolute slaughter." I spent Monday evening finalizing the digital backups and preparing my own testimony. I was ready. I was armored in data and shielded by undeniable facts. The online mob was still screaming my name, completely ignorant of the real war about to unfold. Tuesday morning dawned gray and bitter cold. I dressed in my sharpest, most intimidating charcoal suit. I pulled my hair back into a severe professional bun. I did not look like a vulnerable, estranged daughter. I looked like the senior auditor who had just uncovered the fraud of the century. Martha wore a striking crimson dress projecting absolute vitality and unshakable competence. We rode to the courthouse in silence, the tension in the luxury sedan vibrating like a plucked guitar string. The downtown probate court was a labyrinth of marble hallways and echoing chambers. We navigated the crowds with purposeful strides, Davis leading the way. We arrived at the designated courtroom 10 minutes before the scheduled emergency hearing. Richard and Patricia were already there, seated at the petitioner's table. They were flanked by a sleazy, expensive-looking attorney who was busy organizing a stack of what I presumed were fabricated medical evaluations. Patricia was dressed in conservative, muted tones, clearly attempting to play the role of the exhausted, deeply concerned daughter-in-law. Richard looked pale and anxious, his eyes darting nervously around the room. When they saw us walk through the heavy wooden doors, their confident facade cracked instantly. They had expected me to be a wreck. They had expected the viral smear campaign and the corporate suspension to leave me broken and hysterical. Instead, they saw me walking tall, carrying a thick black leather binder, radiating cold, calculated menace. I did not break eye contact with my father as I took my seat beside Martha at the respondent's table. I saw him swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He knew in that single freezing moment that he had made a catastrophic error. The trap had been set, the bait had been taken, and the jaws were about to snap shut. The hearing room was oppressive, the air was stale, the fluorescent lights hummed a low, aggravating pitch, and the heavy oak paneling made the space feel like a pressure cooker. Judge Harrison, a man notorious in probate court for his lack of patience and sharp intellect, sat elevated behind the bench, shuffling through the preliminary filings. At the petitioner's table, Richard and Patricia sat flanking their attorney, a man named Sterling, whose tailored suit and aggressive posture telegraphed his entire legal strategy. He was a bully hired to steamroll through the proceedings with loud, unfounded accusations. Martha sat beside me, her posture immaculate, her hands resting calmly on the table. Davis sat to my right, tapping a pen against his legal pad. The black leather binder containing the forensic audit sat hidden inside my briefcase, waiting for the perfect moment. Sterling stood up the second the judge called the hearing to order. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He launched immediately into a vicious theatrical opening statement designed to assassinate both Martha's competence and my character. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice booming across the small room, "we are here today because my clients are terrified. They are terrified for the safety and financial well-being of their beloved mother, Martha Anderson. Over the past 6 months, Martha has exhibited textbook signs of severe cognitive decline. She has become deeply paranoid, isolating herself from her loving son, Richard, who successfully managed her estate for a decade." He paused, turning his body to point an accusatory finger directly at me. "And stepping into that vulnerability is her estranged granddaughter, Elise, a woman who was just suspended from her financial auditing firm due to a severe psychiatric break. A woman who burst into a family Thanksgiving dinner, screaming unhinged threats and waving fabricated documents. Elise is manipulating her confused grandmother, attempting to seize control of a vast estate to fund her own instability. We are asking the court to grant an emergency conservatorship to Richard Anderson immediately to stop this financial predation." Judge Harrison peered over his reading glasses, his expression unreadable. He turned his attention to our table. "Mr. Davis, your client's response—" Davis stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with maddening slowness. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet, lethal authority of a man holding a royal flush. "Your Honor," Davis said, "we ask that the court reject this petition in its entirety. My client, Martha Anderson, is of exceptionally sound mind. She recently revoked her son's access to her accounts, not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. Furthermore, we are prepared to demonstrate that this emergency petition was not filed out of concern for Martha's well-being, but out of desperation to cover up a decade of massive financial fraud." Sterling scoffed loudly, slapping his hand on his table. "Objection, Your Honor. Opposing counsel is using this hearing to launch baseless defamatory attacks against my clients." "I will allow it." Judge Harrison ruled, his interest clearly piqued. "But Mr. Davis, you better have substantial evidence to back up that claim." "We do, Your Honor," Davis replied smoothly. "In fact, the primary investigator who uncovered the fraud is sitting right here. Elise Anderson is not a manic extortionist. She is a senior forensic auditor, and she has prepared a comprehensive report detailing the embezzlement of nearly $2 million from Martha Anderson's estate by the petitioner, Richard Anderson." The color vanished from Richard's face. He grabbed Sterling's arm, whispering frantically, but Sterling brushed him off, his arrogant facade cracking just a fraction. "Your Honor, this is outrageous," Sterling protested. "We have received no such report in discovery." "Because the audit was concluded at 2 o'clock this morning, Your Honor," Davis countered. "However, given the petitioner's claim that Martha's assets are in immediate danger of being squandered, we feel it is imperative the court see exactly who has been doing the squandering." Judge Harrison nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Davis." Davis turned to me. "Elise, if you would." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick black leather binder. The heavy thud it made as I placed it on the table echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. I opened the binder, the crisp white pages filled with charts, graphs, and certified bank records gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Your Honor." I began, my voice carrying the absolute unshakable confidence of a professional who knew her numbers were flawless. This binder contains a forensic audit spanning a 10-year period during which Richard Anderson served as Martha Anderson's financial proxy. The audit establishes a clear, undeniable pattern of embezzlement executed through multiple channels. I did not look at my parents. I kept my eyes locked directly on the judge. Exhibit A, I said, flipping to the first tab. A series of unauthorized wire transfers labeled as property maintenance escrow. Over 10 years, these transfers escalated in volume and frequency, totaling over $400,000. Every single transfer was routed directly to a private checking account owned by Patricia Anderson. Patricia let out a strangled gasp. Sterling snatched a copy of the binder Davis handed him and began flipping frantically through the pages. Exhibit B. I continued, the rhythm of the presentation taking over. The systematic liquidation of blue-chip tech stocks from Martha Anderson's primary investment portfolio. Richard Anderson authorized these sales during market volatility, transferring the liquid capital into a limited liability company named Anderson Wealth Strategies. I paused, letting the silence build for exactly 3 seconds. The sole registered officer of Anderson Wealth Strategies is Richard Anderson. He embezzled over $300,000 through this single shell company, classifying the theft as a capital reinvestment strategy. Richard was gripping the edge of his table so tightly his knuckles were white. He was staring at the binder as if it were a bomb about to detonate. "Your Honor, these are fabricated documents," Sterling shouted, though his voice lacked its previous booming confidence. "This woman is suspended from her job for creating fake records. She cannot be trusted." "The bank records are certified, Your Honor," Davis replied calmly. "The wire transfer logs were obtained directly from the financial institutions involved. We welcome any independent verification the court deems necessary." Judge Harrison was reading his copy of the executive summary, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He turned the page, studying the flowchart I had created mapping the stolen funds. "There is more, Your Honor," I stated, drawing the judge's attention back to me. Exhibit C details fraudulent consulting fees paid to a series of failed cryptocurrency ventures owned by Kevin Miller, Richard Anderson's son-in-law. Exhibit D outlines charitable donations routed to a fake nonprofit established by Patricia Anderson. The total amount embezzled over the 10-year period is $1.87 million. The courtroom was absolutely silent. The sheer volume of the evidence, the meticulous categorization of the theft, and the undeniable paper trail had completely paralyzed the petitioners. "Mr. Anderson," Judge Harrison said, his voice deadly quiet, "did you authorize these transfers?" Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Sterling, but his lawyer was furiously reading the documentation, realizing he had walked into a slaughterhouse. "Your Honor," Sterling stammered, attempting a tactical retreat. "My client maintains that all transfers were authorized by his mother as gifts or loans. However, we may need time to review these documents." "I never authorized a single one of those transfers," Martha interrupted, her voice ringing out clear and strong. She did not sound confused. She did not sound senile. She sounded like a wealthy, powerful woman who had just caught a thief. "My son abused his position of trust to rob me blind." Judge Harrison closed the binder. He looked at Richard and Patricia with an expression of absolute disgust. "This court takes allegations of elder financial abuse extremely seriously," Judge Harrison stated, his gavel hovering over the sounding block. "Based on the preliminary evidence presented in this forensic audit, the petition for an emergency conservatorship is denied in its entirety." Patricia let out a high, thin wail. Richard buried his face in his hands. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison continued, "I am issuing an immediate injunction, freezing all assets currently held by Richard and Patricia Anderson pending a full investigation into these embezzlement claims. Martha Anderson is confirmed to be of sound mind and capable of directing her own affairs. The court acknowledges Elise Anderson as the legally designated financial proxy for the respondent." He brought the gavel down with a sharp, definitive crack. "We are adjourned." The tension in the room shattered. Sterling immediately began packing his briefcase, leaning over to whisper furiously to Richard. Patricia was crying openly now, the reality of the asset freeze sinking in. They could not pay the fraudulent mortgage. They could not cover their tracks. They were completely, utterly trapped. I stood up and closed the black leather binder. The ambush had failed. The counterattack was a total, unmitigated success. I helped Martha to her feet, offering her my arm. She took it, her posture as immaculate as ever. We walked past the petitioner's table without a single glance in their direction. We pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the marble hallway of the courthouse. The air felt lighter here. The victory was sweet, but I knew the war was far from over. Richard and Patricia were desperate, and desperate people always made mistakes. I just had to wait for them to make their next move. The concrete walls of the underground parking garage amplified the sharp click of my heels. The air down here was thick with the smell of motor oil and damp earth. I escorted Martha to the waiting black luxury sedan, opening the heavy reinforced door for her. She slid into the leather back seat with a satisfied exhale, the exhaustion of the morning finally catching up to her. I closed the door securely and turned to walk around the rear of the vehicle to the driver's side. That was when he stepped out from the shadows. Kevin emerged from behind a massive concrete support pillar. He looked nothing like the smug, fake entrepreneur who had threatened me in Brittany's kitchen just days ago. His designer suit was wrinkled. His tie was loosened and hanging crookedly around his neck. His face was flushed a dark, blotchy red, and a sheen of frantic sweat coated his forehead. The asset freeze had clearly hit them with the force of a freight train. He was a man watching his entire fraudulent existence evaporate in real time. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stopped moving and stared at him with the same detached clinical evaluation I used to assess a bankrupt ledger. "You think you are so smart?" Kevin spat, his voice echoing harshly against the concrete ceiling. He closed the distance between us, invading my personal space in a blatant attempt at physical intimidation. "You think you can just walk in there with your little binders and ruin our lives?" My hand slid smoothly into the pocket of my overcoat. My fingers wrapped around my smartphone. With a single practiced motion, I unlocked the screen and pressed the record button on my audio application. I kept the phone concealed in my pocket, capturing every single sound. "I did not ruin your life, Kevin," I replied, my voice projecting calm authority. "Your complete lack of legitimate income and your decision to participate in federal wire fraud ruined your life. I simply presented the math to a judge." "You are going to fix this," he demanded, jabbing a thick finger toward my face. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with desperate anger. "You are going back to the bank today. You are going to sign a retroactive approval for that mortgage stating you gave Patricia permission to use your identity. And then you are going to drop this entire investigation into Martha's accounts." I let out a short, hollow laugh. "You want me to commit perjury and admit to a $1.2 million liability just so you and Brittany can keep playing pretend on the internet. That is incredibly delusional, even for a failed crypto investor." Kevin's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He took another step forward, backing me slightly against the trunk of the sedan. He lowered his voice to a guttural, menacing growl. "You do not understand what is happening here, Elise. If that house goes into foreclosure, Brittany will lose her mind. She will lose her brand deals. We will have absolutely nothing. I will not let you take my wife's dream away from her." He leaned in closer, his breath hot and reeking of stale coffee. "You walk alone to your car every single day. Accidents happen in the city all the time. People get hurt when they destroy families. If you do not sign that paperwork and drop this audit, I will personally make sure you never walk into another auditing firm again. Do you understand me?" He was threatening physical violence. He was actively trying to extort a federal witness. It was the exact catastrophic mistake I had been waiting for. I did not cower. I pulled my hand out of my overcoat pocket and held my smartphone directly in front of his face. The screen was brightly illuminated, displaying the audio recording application. The red timer was ticking steadily upward, capturing 30 seconds of crystal-clear, high-definition audio. "I understand perfectly, Kevin," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. You just threatened physical harm against the legally appointed financial proxy of an ongoing probate investigation. You attempted to extort me into signing a fraudulent mortgage agreement under the threat of violence. That is not just a mistake. That is a felony. Kevin stared at the glowing red recording timer. The aggressive, threatening posture melted off his body instantly. His eyes widened in absolute terror as his brain processed the legal reality of what he had just done. He took a rapid, stumbling step backward, holding his hands up defensively. I did not mean it like that. He stammered, his tough guy persona entirely shattered. Elise, come on. I am just stressed. The bank called us this morning. They are threatening immediate default. Save your excuses for your defense attorney, I replied, opening the car door. Do not ever approach me again. I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, leaving Kevin standing alone in the dark, damp parking garage. He looked pathetic, a desperate man watching his final attempt at control slip through his fingers. I put the car in gear and drove up the ramp, emerging into the bright, freezing daylight of downtown Chicago. What was that about? Martha asked from the back seat, having watched the silent exchange through the tinted windows. Kevin just provided us with the leverage we need to escalate this war. I told her, stopping at a red light and forwarding the audio file directly to a secure cloud server. We are officially done with probate court, Martha. It is time to bring in the heavy artillery. That afternoon, we did not return to Martha's penthouse. We drove directly to the commercial district to meet with one of the most ruthless federal fraud attorneys in the city, a man named Mr. Caldwell. Caldwell was a former federal prosecutor who specialized in complex financial crimes, asset recovery, and racketeering. If Davis was a sniper in probate court, Caldwell was a carpet bomber in the federal arena. We sat in his sleek, glass-walled office on the 40th floor. I placed the black leather binder on his desk alongside the freshly recorded audio file of Kevin's extortion attempt. Caldwell listened to the recording twice, his expression remaining perfectly neutral. Then he reviewed the executive summary of my forensic audit, his eyes tracking the flow of the stolen trust funds into Kevin's Delaware shell company. This is remarkably thorough, Elise, Caldwell noted, closing the binder. You have essentially handed me a fully prepared indictment. The identity theft for the mortgage is a clear-cut federal offense. The embezzlement from Martha's estate is grand larceny. And this audio recording elevates Kevin's involvement to felony extortion and witness intimidation. I want a restraining order filed against him immediately, I stated, leaning forward in my leather chair. But more importantly, I want to dissect their current income streams. Patricia and Richard are frozen. They have no access to Martha's money. That means they are going to turn to Brittany and Kevin for a financial bailout. I need to know exactly how much liquid capital my sister actually possesses. Caldwell nodded in agreement. To do that, we need a specialist. I am bringing in a private investigator named Bennett. He is a retired investigator for the Internal Revenue Service. He knows how to track hidden digital assets, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency ledgers. Within 24 hours, Bennett was fully integrated into our war room. He set up a secure encrypted network in Martha's guest suite, linking his specialized tracking software directly to my auditing databases. The restraining order against Kevin was granted immediately by a judge, ensuring my physical safety while we worked. With the perimeter secured, I turned my absolute undivided focus onto Brittany's lifestyle influencer business and Kevin's mysterious crypto history. My sister portrayed herself as a wildly successful self-made entrepreneur. She constantly posted photos of designer shopping bags, luxury vehicles, and brand-sponsored vacations. She claimed her wealth was generated through brand partnerships, affiliate marketing, and her exclusive online community. But as an auditor, I knew that social media was a house of mirrors. People could rent private jets by the hour and buy empty designer shopping bags to fake a rich lifestyle. I needed to see the raw, unfiltered data of her actual cash flow. Bennett initiated a deep web background check on Kevin's Delaware limited liability company. While he traced the digital footprints, I started reverse engineering Brittany's public income streams. I cataloged every single brand deal she had posted over the last 2 years. I calculated the average industry payout for an influencer with 500,000 followers. I factored in her estimated engagement rates, her YouTube ad revenue, and her affiliate link conversions. The math was completely wrong. Look at this, I said, pointing at my monitor as Bennett walked over with a fresh pot of coffee. Brittany's public-facing income is a mirage. Based on her actual engagement metrics and the tier of brands she works with, her legitimate gross income is maybe $80,000 a year. That is decent money, but it absolutely does not support a $1.2 million mortgage, multiple luxury car leases, and weekly trips to high-end boutiques. Bennett adjusted his glasses, staring at the spreadsheet I had created. She is spending roughly $300,000 a year just to maintain her baseline aesthetic. There is a massive deficit between her legitimate earnings and her actual expenditures. Exactly, I confirmed, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Which brings us back to Kevin. Patricia and Richard stole $200,000 from my educational trust and wired it to Kevin's shell company. They claimed it was a bridge loan for his cryptocurrency startup. But Kevin is a notoriously terrible investor. If he actually put that money into volatile crypto markets 18 months ago, he would have lost 80% of it during the crash. Bennett sat down at his workstation and pulled up the blockchain tracking software he had been running overnight. He had managed to connect Kevin's public email address to a series of digital wallets on various cryptocurrency exchanges. You are right about his trading skills, Bennett noted, pulling up a deeply negative profit and loss graph. Kevin did try to day trade crypto. He lost about $40,000 in the first 3 months. But here is the interesting part. He stopped trading entirely after that. I spun my chair around to look at Bennett's screen. If he stopped trading, where did the rest of the stolen trust fund money go? It did not vanish, Bennett explained, tracing a digital line connecting several offshore nodes. He used a cryptocurrency tumbling service to obscure the origin of the remaining funds. A tumbler mixes identifiable digital currency with other funds to make tracking difficult. But I used to do this for the federal government. I can untangle it. We sat in silence for 2 hours as Bennett ran the decryption protocols. The tension in the room was palpable. We were hunting for the missing $160,000 of my stolen inheritance. If we could prove Kevin still had the money, we could seize it to secure my financial future. Suddenly, Bennett's computer beeped. The tracking software had successfully mapped the destination of the tumbled cryptocurrency. The funds had been converted back into standard US dollars and deposited into a business checking account. I have the destination account, Bennett announced, his voice tight with anticipation. He pulled up the corporate registry tied to the routing number. He stared at the screen, his eyes widening in shock. Elise, you need to see this. I walked over and leaned down to read the corporate registration document. The account did not belong to a crypto exchange. It did not belong to a shady offshore bank. It belonged to a registered 501c3 charitable organization. The charity was called the Golden Light Foundation, and the listed founder and president of the charity was my sister Brittany. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped into place with terrifying, devastating clarity. Brittany was not just faking her influencer wealth. Kevin was not just losing money on digital coins. They had built something far more sinister. I stood up, my mind racing as the full scope of their financial depravity finally revealed itself. The parking garage threat was just the desperate flailing of a man trying to protect a much darker, much more lucrative secret. We were about to tear Brittany's entire world apart. I stared at the name of the charity on Bennett's monitor, the Golden Light Foundation. The title sounded sickeningly pure, practically dripping with the manufactured, highly curated positivity my sister utilized to sell her brand. I pulled up the public tax filings for the 501c3 organization. The registered mission statement claimed the foundation was dedicated to empowering young women struggling with financial instability and severe mental health crises. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of it hit me like a physical blow. Brittany was actively exploiting the exact same trauma and financial desperation our parents had weaponized against me. She was using the concept of mental health advocacy as a financial shield. I rolled my chair to my secondary monitor and opened my dummy social media account. I navigated directly to Brittany's influencer profile. I clicked through her story highlights specifically looking for anything related to the Golden Light Foundation. There were dozens of them. I watched video after video of my sister sitting in perfectly lit rooms wearing oversized sweaters, crying delicate tears as she begged her 500,000 followers to support her charitable mission. She spoke passionately about the importance of giving back. She posted direct links to donation portals. She hosted virtual charity drives offering exclusive merchandise to anyone who donated more than $50. Her followers, completely captivated by her emotional performances, opened their wallets. I watched the comments roll in on the archived posts. College students giving up their coffee money, single mothers donating $10 here and $20 there, all believing they were contributing to a noble cause. They were not funding a noble cause. They were funding my sister's designer wardrobe. I turned back to the banking software. Bennett had successfully mapped the inflow of cash from the online donation portals directly into the foundation's primary operating account. Over the past 2 years, Brittany's loyal followers had donated just over $800,000. But charities are legally required to disperse their funds toward their stated mission. They are subject to strict federal regulations. To get the money out of the charity and into their own pockets without triggering an automatic audit from the Internal Revenue Service, Brittany and Kevin needed a highly sophisticated laundering mechanism. That was exactly what they had built. I opened a fresh blank spreadsheet and began to forensically dismantle the outflow of the foundation's assets. I started cross-referencing the charity's expense ledgers with the corporate registry databases Bennett had pulled. The money was not being spent on women in need. It was being aggressively siphoned out under the guise of exorbitant administrative expenses, aggressive marketing budgets, and independent consulting fees. I traced a monthly recurring payment of $15,000 listed as Digital Outreach Management. The vendor receiving the payment was Anderson Wealth Strategies, the exact same shell company my father Richard had used to embezzle from Grandma Martha's stock portfolio. Richard was charging his daughter's fake charity a massive monthly retainer, effectively washing the donated money and turning it into personal income to fund Patricia's country club memberships. But Kevin and Brittany were the primary beneficiaries of this massive tax evasion scheme. I pulled up the foundation's operational expense accounts. I split my screens, putting the charity's bank statements on the left and Brittany's Instagram grid on the right. I began to match the dates of the financial withdrawals to the timestamps of her luxurious social media posts. The precision of the fraud was absolute. On March 14th, the Golden Light Foundation authorized a $12,000 withdrawal, categorized as a mental health, wellness, and leadership retreat. On March 15th, Brittany posted a photo of herself and Kevin sitting in the first-class cabin of a flight to Milan, Italy. On July 8th, the charity logged an $85,000 expenditure for a mobile community outreach vehicle. On July 10th, Kevin posted a video to his own profile revving the engine of a brand new imported Porsche sports car. On September 2nd, a $20,000 withdrawal was labeled as Executive Wardrobe for Public Relations. The very next day, Brittany uploaded a shopping haul video featuring 3 authentic Hermes handbags. Every single luxury they possessed was entirely funded by the charitable donations of working-class people who trusted my sister. And then the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle locked into place. I looked back at the initial deposit that had seeded the charity's bank account 18 months ago. To register a 501c3 organization and clear the initial federal hurdles without raising immediate red flags, you need substantial starting capital to demonstrate legitimate operational capacity. You cannot start a major foundation with $0 in the bank. I traced the tumbling sequence Bennett had decrypted from Kevin's cryptocurrency wallets. The $160,000 that Kevin had supposedly lost in the crypto markets had not been lost at all. He had washed the money through digital tumblers to erase its origin, converted it back into standard U.S. currency, and deposited it directly into the Golden Light Foundation as an anonymous philanthropic grant. They had used my stolen inheritance to open the doors of their federal scam. They had stolen my grandfather's money, the money meant to secure my future and pay for my education, to build the engine of a massive multi-tiered tax evasion machine. Furthermore, I finally understood exactly why they had stolen my social security number to buy the mansion. The pieces of the financial conspiracy formed a perfect airtight circle. Brittany and Kevin were sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen charity funds, but because the money was effectively embezzled, they could not report it as legitimate taxable income on a loan application. If they applied for a $1.2 million mortgage and claimed they made enough money to afford the payments, the bank would demand 2 years of W-2 tax returns. If they provided those returns, the IRS would instantly realize their income did not match their lifestyle, triggering a catastrophic audit. They had raw, stolen cash for a massive down payment, but they lacked the verifiable clean credit history required to secure the actual mortgage. That was where my identity became their most valuable asset. I had a flawless credit score, zero debt, and a highly verifiable high-income corporate job. They stole my identity to satisfy the bank's underwriting requirements while using the laundered charity money to make the actual payments. They had weaponized my entire existence to sustain their fraud. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting off my face. The sheer scale of their criminality was breathtaking. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a toxic family dynamic. This was no longer just a probate issue regarding an elderly woman's estate. This was a highly organized, multi-million-dollar racketeering enterprise. Wire fraud, identity theft, elder financial abuse, charity fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. I hit print on the master spreadsheet. The printer whirred to life, churning out page after page of undeniable federal-level evidence. I compiled the documents, the screenshots of Brittany's social media posts, the decrypted cryptocurrency ledgers, and the forged mortgage signatures into a massive, meticulously indexed dossier. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Caldwell. The federal fraud attorney answered on the second ring. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, my voice vibrating with dark, anticipatory energy, "I need you to contact your former colleagues at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS immediately." "What did you find?" Elise Caldwell asked, his tone shifting into absolute professional focus. "I found the bottom of the rabbit hole," I replied. "My family is currently operating a fraudulent 501c3 charity. They are washing hundreds of thousands of dollars in follower donations to evade federal taxes and fund their luxury lifestyle. They used the stolen funds from my grandfather's trust to seed the operation, and they used my stolen identity to secure their real estate because their actual income is entirely illegitimate. I have the entire network documented, verified, and ready for federal prosecution." There was a heavy pause on the line. Even a seasoned prosecutor like Caldwell was momentarily stunned by the magnitude of the discovery. "Excellent work, Elise," he finally said. "I am making the calls right now." When a forensic auditor hands the federal government a fully packaged, bow-tied indictment with absolute proof of charity fraud and tax evasion, the agencies move with terrifying speed. They will want to secure warrants immediately to prevent your family from destroying physical evidence or fleeing the jurisdiction. "Tell the federal agents not to execute the warrants today," I instructed, my eyes drifting back to Brittany's social media profile. Caldwell sounded confused. "We have the evidence, Elise. Why delay the strike? If they realize you know about the charity, they might try to empty the accounts and run." "They are not going anywhere," I assured him, a cold smile spreading across my face. I opened a recent post on Brittany's page. It was a digital invitation adorned with sparkling gold graphics and elegant calligraphy. "Brittany and my parents are hosting a massive event this coming Saturday night," I explained, reading the details from the screen. "It is the Golden Light Foundation's annual Christmas charity gala. They are hosting it at the suburban mansion they bought with my stolen identity. They have invited local politicians, wealthy socialites, and dozens of high-profile corporate sponsors. They are using this party to secure massive new investments from their rich friends to bail themselves out of the impending mortgage default." "I understand," Caldwell said, the realization dawning in his voice. "You want to make an example out of them." "I want absolute total annihilation," I confirmed. I want the federal agents to walk through the front doors of that mansion in the middle of their champagne toasts. I want every single investor, every politician, and every country club friend to watch Patricia, Richard, Brittany, and Kevin get placed in handcuffs. I want them to lose everything in front of the exact audience they sacrificed my life to impress. It will require precise coordination with the federal field office and the local mortgage lender, Caldwell noted. But given the strength of this dossier, I can guarantee the authorities will be more than happy to make a highly public, high-profile arrest at a charity gala. It sends a very strong message about tax fraud. I will arrange a secure meeting with the lead investigators tomorrow morning. Bring the binder. I disconnected the call and looked over at Bennett, who was leaning back in his chair, shaking his head in quiet disbelief at the sheer audacity of my family's crimes. "We have them," Bennett said softly. "Yes, we do," I agreed. I gathered the freshly printed dossier and placed it safely inside my briefcase. Patricia and Richard thought they had destroyed my life by suspending me from my firm and setting a digital mob on me. They thought they had silenced me, but they had simply given me the silence I needed to build their perfect prison. The trap was fully set, heavily baited, and waiting for Saturday night. The days leading up to the second Saturday in December were a masterpiece of silent synchronization. Caldwell had leveraged his extensive federal connections, turning my forensic audit into a priority case for a joint task force comprising the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Unit. The magnitude of the tax evasion coupled with the brazen nature of the charity fraud had ignited a firestorm within the agencies. But I was not content to simply hand over the evidence and watch from the sidelines. I required total control over the execution. I needed the timing to be absolutely flawless. My parents were desperate. The asset freeze generated by the probate court had completely paralyzed their liquidity. The $1.2 million mortgage on Brittany's mansion was in catastrophic default, and the bank was preparing to initiate the foreclosure process. Richard and Patricia had exactly one remaining play to avoid complete financial ruin. They were hosting the Golden Light Foundation's annual Christmas charity gala at the fraudulent suburban estate. Their strategy was transparently pathetic. They intended to pack the mansion with wealthy socialites, local politicians, and vulnerable corporate sponsors. Patricia would play the role of the benevolent matriarch, while Brittany wept delicate tears about her charitable mission. They planned to secure massive immediate donations from their rich friends, funnel the cash through their laundering operation, and use the stolen funds to quietly satisfy the bank and lift the default status. They were attempting to cure a massive fraud by committing an even larger fraud in front of hundreds of witnesses. They had no idea that I controlled the very ground they were standing on. Because my parents had committed identity theft to secure the property, my name was legally listed on the deed and the mortgage agreement. From the bank's perspective, I was the primary borrower. This gave me unprecedented legal authority to negotiate directly with the financial institution holding the note. I sat in a secure conference room at the bank's regional headquarters flanked by Caldwell and Bennett. Across the table sat the bank's senior risk management officers and their lead counsel. I did not attempt to deny the default. Instead, I laid out the exact details of the identity theft, the forged signatures, and the impending federal indictments against my family. I am the victim of a sophisticated fraud ring orchestrated by the secondary signatories. I explained, sliding the federal task force's preliminary case number across the polished table. The individuals currently occupying the property are running an illegal laundering operation. They are planning to host a massive fundraising gala this Saturday night to solicit further fraudulent donations. The bank's lead counsel frowned, reviewing the documentation. "Ms. Anderson, if your identity was stolen, we will obviously freeze the foreclosure proceedings against you while the federal investigation clears your name. However, the bank must protect its asset. We have the right to serve a formal notice of default and initiate eviction proceedings against the physical occupants immediately." "I am not asking you to delay the eviction," I said, leaning forward, my voice dropping to a precise, calculated cadence. "I am asking you to accelerate it. I want you to execute the formal service of the default and the eviction notice this Saturday night." At exactly 8:30 in the evening. The bank officers exchanged surprised glances. "You want us to serve the papers during a high-profile holiday gala?" the risk manager asked, raising an eyebrow. "I want you to serve the papers simultaneously with the execution of the federal search warrants." Caldwell interjected, his tone authoritative. "The FBI and the IRS will be hitting the property at exactly 8:30. We are requesting that your process server coordinate with the federal strike team. We want the bank's legal action to be part of the initial wave." The bank's counsel smiled, a slow, predatory expression. They understood exactly what we were orchestrating. It was not just a legal maneuver, it was a highly visible, undeniable demonstration of the bank's aggressive stance against mortgage fraud. "We can absolutely accommodate that timeline," the counsel confirmed. "The process server will be on site with the federal agents." With the bank secured, I returned to Martha's penthouse to finalize the digital trap. The federal agents were securing the physical premises, but I needed to ensure that the financial evidence was inescapable for every single guest attending the gala. Patricia and Richard would undoubtedly attempt to spin the raid as a misunderstanding or a clerical error. I needed to publicly execute their reputation before they could utter a single excuse. Bennett and I worked late into the night constructing a highly compressed, visually devastating presentation. We condensed the massive forensic audit into a 10-minute digital slideshow. We created stark, undeniable graphics linking the Golden Light Foundation's donation portals directly to Kevin's offshore cryptocurrency tumblers and Patricia's personal checking accounts. We placed screenshots of Brittany's luxury shopping hauls side by side with the corresponding fraudulent charity withdrawals. The presentation was brutal. It was a digital guillotine designed to sever their social standing completely. "How do you plan on broadcasting this?" Bennett asked, reviewing the final slides. "You cannot exactly ask them to dim the lights and pull down a projector screen." "I do not need to," I replied, pulling up the technical specifications for the smart home system installed in Brittany's mansion. When my parents built the house, they spared no expense on the audio-visual integration. The entire house is networked. The living room features an 85-inch smart television, and the audio system is wired through the ceilings of every room on the first floor. It is all controlled via a central application. I handed Bennett a USB drive containing the presentation file. "I need you to bypass their local network security and establish a remote backdoor into the audio-visual control system. When I give the signal, I want you to override their holiday music and broadcast this presentation simultaneously to every screen and speaker in the house." Bennett took the drive, a fierce grin lighting up his face. A hostile takeover of their smart home. Consider it done. Saturday arrived with a heavy, oppressive snowfall that blanketed the Chicago suburbs. The weather felt appropriately dramatic for the reckoning I had prepared. I spent the afternoon going over the final operational details with Caldwell and the federal task force commanders via a secure conference call. The strike plan was immaculate. At 8 o'clock, Martha and I would breach the perimeter and enter the gala. At 8:15, I would signal Bennett to initiate the audio-visual override, trapping the guests in a mandatory viewing of the forensic audit. At exactly 8:30, the federal strike team, accompanied by the bank's process server, would execute the warrants and seal the property. I dressed with meticulous care. I selected a deep emerald gown that was elegant, commanding, and absolutely uncompromising. I pulled my hair into a sleek, severe style that left my features completely exposed. I was not hiding. I was stepping directly into the center of the arena. Martha wore a striking black velvet suit adorned with a massive, authentic diamond brooch. She looked like a queen preparing to banish traitors from her court. "Are you ready for this, Elise?" Martha asked as we rode in the back of the private car toward the suburbs. The snow was falling heavily against the tinted windows, isolating us in a quiet cocoon of anticipation. "I have been ready for this since the moment they left me sitting alone in that restaurant," I replied, my voice completely devoid of hesitation. "They built their entire lives on a foundation of lies. Tonight we removed the foundation." We pulled into the sprawling neighborhood. The street was choked with luxury vehicles, stretch limousines, and private town cars. The Golden Light Foundation Gala had clearly drawn the elite of Chicago's suburban high society. The mansion itself was ablaze with light, looking like a glowing beacon of fraudulent philanthropy. I instructed our driver to park 2 blocks away out of sight from the valet stand. Martha and I walked the remaining distance through the biting cold, our heels crunching softly against the fresh snow. We bypassed the main entrance where hired security guards were checking invitations against a master list. Instead, I led Martha around the side of the property, utilizing the catering entrance near the expansive garage. The noise of the party drifted through the thick walls. I could hear the clinking of champagne flutes, the soft hum of holiday music, and the overlapping conversations of people preparing to hand their money over to a criminal syndicate. I paused at the heavy metal catering door, pulling my phone from my clutch. I sent a single predetermined text message to Caldwell, confirming our position. I then opened my encrypted messaging application and typed a quick note to Bennett, who was monitoring the network from Martha's penthouse. In position. Stand by for the override signal. I slipped my phone back into my bag and turned to Martha. We exchanged a single resolute nod. I grabbed the handle of the catering door and pulled it open, stepping out of the freezing shadows and directly into the blinding, chaotic heart of my family's final performance. The stage was set, the audience was captive, and the curtain was about to fall. The heavy catering door clicked shut behind us, sealing out the freezing wind. We stood in a bustling staging area where hired staff rushed past with silver trays of champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. No one questioned our presence. Martha carried herself with such absolute authority that the catering staff simply parted like the Red Sea to let us through. We stepped from the prep area directly into the sprawling open-concept living room. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. The mansion had been transformed into a winter wonderland of corporate extortion. Massive crystal chandeliers reflected off the imported marble floors. A 10-foot Christmas tree adorned with gold ribbons dominated the far corner. Waiters in crisp tuxedos circulated among groups of Chicago's wealthiest socialites, local politicians, and high-level corporate executives. I scanned the room, locating my targets with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. Brittany was holding court near the grand staircase, wearing a custom sequined gown. She was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, performing her signature routine for a group of wealthy older women. She was actively soliciting donations, pitching her fake charity with practiced, tearful vulnerability. Across the room, Patricia and Richard were working the corporate sponsors. Patricia was draped in diamonds, laughing loudly at a joke made by a prominent local alderman. Richard stood beside her, clutching a glass of scotch, projecting the image of a seasoned philanthropic patriarch. Martha and I walked directly into the center of the room. The crowd was dense, but our dark, severe attire cut through the sea of festive holiday colors like a blade. It took Patricia exactly 45 seconds to notice us. I watched her gaze sweep across the room and lock onto my face. The champagne glass in her hand jerked violently, spilling expensive liquor onto her designer shoes. She excused herself from the alderman with a tight, strained smile and practically sprinted toward us. "Elise," she hissed, grabbing my arm with bruising force, her face a mask of barely contained panic. "What are you doing here? You are completely unhinged. You need to leave this property immediately before I call security and have you dragged out in handcuffs." I calmly reached down and peeled her fingers off my jacket one by one. "You cannot trespass me from my own property, Mother," I replied, my voice completely level. "My name is on the deed. My social security number secured the mortgage. From a legal standpoint, you are a guest in my home, and I am about to give a toast." Before Patricia could signal the private security guard standing near the front entrance, I bypassed her completely. I walked with purposeful, commanding strides directly to the small raised platform that had been set up for the evening's speeches. A polished microphone stood on a stand waiting for Patricia's welcome address. I stepped up to the microphone and tapped it twice. The sharp percussive sound echoed through the massive integrated audio system, instantly cutting through the chatter of 200 wealthy guests. The room fell into a confused, expectant silence. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice projecting with absolute crystal-clear authority. I pulled my phone from my clutch and hit send on the encrypted message to Bennett. Override initiated. Above me, the massive 85-inch smart television screen mounted above the stone fireplace flickered. The generic holiday screensaver vanished. It was instantly replaced by a stark white title slide bearing the crest of the federal task force and the words, Golden Light Foundation Forensic Financial Audit. My name is Elise Anderson. I continued staring out at the sea of confused, affluent faces. I am a senior financial auditor, and my name is currently listed on the mortgage of the building you are standing in. You have all been invited here tonight under the pretense of charitable giving. You have been told your investments will empower vulnerable women facing mental health crises. I am here to provide full financial transparency regarding exactly where your money is going. Behind me, the screen advanced to the first slide. It displayed a side-by-side comparison. On the left was the charity's official bank statement showing a massive influx of donor funds. On the right was the private checking account belonging to Patricia Anderson. I pointed to the screen. Over the past 18 months, the Golden Light Foundation has funneled exactly $180,000 of your charitable donations directly into the personal accounts of Patricia and Richard Anderson, disguised as fraudulent consulting fees. They used your generosity to pay for their country club memberships, their luxury car leases, and the catered food you are eating tonight. The crowd gasped. A low murmur of outrage began to ripple through the room. Several corporate sponsors immediately set their drinks down, their expressions hardening into absolute fury. Richard lunged toward the audio-visual control panel on the wall, frantically punching buttons in a desperate attempt to turn the screen off. Nothing happened. Bennett had completely locked them out of their own system. "Turn it off!" Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "Security, get her out of here right now. She is a manic bipolar liar." I did not even flinch. I advanced to the next slide. This one was visually devastating. It showed Brittany's tearful social media pleas for donations directly adjacent to her luxury shopping haul videos and the corresponding fraudulent bank withdrawals. "Let us look at the foundation's president, Brittany Miller," I announced, my voice slicing through Richard's frantic shouting. On September 2nd, she authorized a $20,000 withdrawal from the charity marked as Executive Wardrobe for Public Relations. On September 3rd, she purchased 3 authentic Hermes handbags. Your donations did not help vulnerable women. They bought designer accessories for an influencer operating a sophisticated tax evasion scheme. Brittany let out a shrill, terrified scream. She covered her face with her hands, dropping to her knees in the middle of the marble floor as her wealthy friends stared at her in absolute disgust. Kevin tried to grab the television cord to rip it from the wall, but the screen was flush-mounted. He was entirely helpless. I moved to the final slide. To launch this federal scam, Kevin and Brittany required seed money to prove operational capacity to the Internal Revenue Service, I explained, keeping my gaze locked on my mother, who was currently leaning against a pillar hyperventilating. They secured that seed money when Patricia and Richard embezzled $200,000 from an educational trust left to me by my late grandfather. When they realized they had stolen cash but lacked the clean credit history to buy this mansion, they stole my identity and forged my signature to secure a $1.2 million mortgage. The silence in the room was now absolute and terrifying. The local politicians were already inching toward the coat check, desperate to distance themselves from a massive federal crime scene. The corporate sponsors were furiously typing on their phones, likely alerting their legal departments to freeze any pending donations. The entire social and financial empire my parents had ruthlessly constructed over 3 decades had just been vaporized in less than 5 minutes. "You invited these people here tonight to bail you out of a catastrophic mortgage default," I concluded, my voice ringing with total finality. "You thought you could use your daughter's fake tears and your own country club charm to rob these investors blind, just like you robbed me. But the audit is complete. Your ledgers are exposed, and your fraudulent foundation is officially closed for business." I stepped down from the platform. The crowd parted for me exactly the way they had parted for Martha earlier. Nobody spoke to my parents. Nobody offered Brittany a helping hand as she sobbed on the marble floor. They were pariahs infected with the most toxic disease in high society, undeniable public poverty and federal criminality. I walked back to where Martha stood waiting. She looked at Richard, her only son, with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. We had successfully executed the social destruction. We had ripped the mask off their pristine suburban facade and showed the entire world the rotting decay underneath. Every single person in that room now knew that the Anderson family was nothing more than a ring of desperate thieves. But the true penalty, the absolute final consequence, was waiting right outside the front doors. Brittany's scream tore through the shocked silence of the living room, a shrill, desperate sound that grated against the high ceilings of her fraudulent mansion. She dropped to the marble floor, her sequined gown pooling around her as she clutched her head, sobbing uncontrollably. Kevin, his face a mask of panicked rage, shoved past two stunned corporate sponsors and vaulted over the glass coffee table. He scrambled toward the massive smart TV, his hands frantically clawing at the wall, desperately searching for the power cord to rip the undeniable truth from the screen. But the house was too well built. The wiring was integrated deep within the drywall, making the visual execution inescapable. Before Kevin could smash the screen itself, the heavy brass knocker on the front double doors slammed against the wood. The sound was not a polite, hesitant knock. It was the loud, aggressive, synchronized pounding of law enforcement announcing their arrival. Patricia froze, her champagne glass slipping entirely from her manicured hand. It hit the marble floor, shattering into a dozen sharp, glittering pieces, the expensive alcohol pooling around the tips of her designer heels. The heavy doors swung open, practically bursting off their hinges. "Federal agents!" A commanding voice boomed over the hushed whispers of the affluent crowd. "Nobody move!" A coordinated strike team surged into the grand entryway. The agents were clad in dark windbreakers bearing the bold yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They fanned out with practiced, terrifying efficiency, immediately securing every exit point of the sprawling estate. Following closely behind the federal agents was a man in a plain gray suit, carrying a thick stack of legal documents clipped to a rigid clipboard. He was the process server for the bank. Because my name was legally printed on the deed and the mortgage agreement I had granted the bank absolute undeniable authorization to enter the premises and execute the formal notice of default. I had opened the front doors of my own stolen property and invited the authorities inside. Richard Anderson, the lead FBI agent, called out, his eyes sweeping the room until he locked onto my father. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering." Two agents flanked my father before he could take a single step backward. They seized his arms, pulling them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent room, a sound so final and absolute it made my blood run cold. Richard did not fight. He simply let out a low, pathetic whimper, his shoulders slumping as the last remaining shred of his false dignity evaporated. "Kevin Miller," another agent announced, marching directly toward the fireplace where Kevin was still frozen in shock. "You are under arrest for tax evasion, conspiracy to commit fraud, and operating a fraudulent charitable organization." Kevin tried to pull away, but the agents were too fast. They spun him around, slamming him roughly against the very smart TV that was currently broadcasting the exact digital ledger of his crimes. As they secured the handcuffs, the process server from the bank stepped forward, navigating through the frozen, horrified crowd of socialites and politicians. He approached Patricia, who was standing completely paralyzed near the kitchen island, her face pale as a ghost. "Patricia Anderson," the server said, his voice flat and clinical. He thrust the thick stack of legal documents directly into her trembling hands. "You are hereby served with a formal notice of foreclosure and immediate eviction proceedings. The bank is seizing this asset." Patricia stared down at the documents, her eyes wide and uncomprehending. The reality of the moment finally crashed over her. She looked up, her gaze desperately searching the room until she found me standing near the catering entrance, flanked by Grandma Martha. "Elise," Patricia croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, you have to stop this." I did not smile. I did not gloat. I looked at the woman who had spent 33 years making me feel completely worthless, who had stolen my identity, and who had actively tried to destroy my career and institutionalize my grandmother. "I cannot stop a federal investigation, Mother," I replied, my voice carrying clearly across the room. And I certainly cannot pay the mortgage on a house you bought with my stolen social security number. You built this prison. Now you get to live in it. The federal agents began escorting Richard and Kevin toward the front doors. The wealthy guests, the politicians, and the corporate sponsors shrank back, pressing themselves against the walls to avoid any association with the arrested men. Brittany was still on the floor, wailing hysterically, as an IRS agent began tagging the expensive furniture and the imported artwork with bright red seizure stickers. Martha placed a firm, steady hand on my shoulder. "We are done here, Elise," she said quietly. "Let the authorities take out the trash." We turned and walked back out through the catering doors, leaving the ruins of my family's fraudulent empire behind us. 3 months later, the dust had finally settled, revealing a landscape completely transformed by the consequences of the audit. The federal prosecution moved with brutal, overwhelming speed. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence I had compiled, both Richard and Kevin realized that a trial would be financial suicide and likely result in maximum sentences. They accepted harsh plea deals. Richard was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for wire fraud and identity theft. Kevin received 6 years for tax evasion and operating a fraudulent charity. The court also ordered massive financial restitution, effectively wiping out any remaining hidden assets they possessed. Patricia managed to avoid federal prison time by claiming ignorance of the charity fraud, though the IRS aggressively pursued her for the unpaid taxes on the embezzled funds. With Richard incarcerated and all their assets seized or frozen, she was left entirely destitute. She currently lives in a cramped, poorly lit one-bedroom apartment in a decaying suburb far from her beloved country club. She works as a cashier at a discount retail store, completely ostracized by the wealthy friends she sacrificed my life to impress. None of them return her calls. Brittany's downfall was perhaps the most public and humiliating. The federal exposure of the Golden Light Foundation completely annihilated her influencer career. Her 500,000 followers turned into an angry, vicious mob, relentlessly attacking her social media profiles until she was forced to delete every single account. Brands dropped her, immediately issuing public statements condemning her actions. She moved into the cramped apartment with Patricia stripped of her designer bags, her luxury cars, and her golden child status. She is now just a disgraced, unemployed woman facing mounting legal bills and a husband in federal lockup. As for my own life, the restoration was absolute. Mr. Harrison, the senior managing partner at my auditing firm, had read the detailed federal indictment with shock and profound embarrassment. He realized exactly how thoroughly Patricia had manipulated the firm's leadership. I was fully reinstated the very next week with back pay and a formal written apology from the executive board. But my return to the firm was not just a reinstatement. The meticulous, flawless nature of the forensic audit I had constructed caught the attention of the highest levels of corporate leadership. They recognized that I possessed an unparalleled ability to track hidden assets and untangle complex, multi-tiered financial fraud. 2 months after the raid, I was promoted from junior partner to senior partner, tasked with leading the firm's elite forensic accounting division. I no longer worked 80-hour weeks, desperately trying to earn the approval of a family that never valued me. I worked because I was exceptionally good at my job, and because I commanded absolute respect in my field. It was late November again, exactly 1 year since I had sat alone in that private downtown dining room, staring at an empty table and crying over people who were actively robbing me blind. The air outside was biting and cold, but the atmosphere inside my newly purchased sprawling downtown loft was warm and brilliantly illuminated. I stood in my open-concept kitchen, which featured gorgeous dark quartz countertops and state-of-the-art appliances. The aroma of roasted turkey, fresh herbs, and expensive wine filled the air. I was hosting Thanksgiving. The long, custom-built dining table was set for 12 people. But this time the seats were not empty. The table was surrounded by genuine laughter and authentic connection. My closest colleagues from the firm were there sharing stories and pouring wine. Mr. Caldwell, the federal attorney who had helped execute the raid, sat near the end of the table, currently engaged in a lively debate with Bennett, the retired IRS investigator. And sitting directly to my right, occupying the place of honor, was Grandma Martha. She looked radiant, completely healthy, and entirely unbothered by the absence of her son. She raised her crystal glass, catching my eye across the table. "To Elise?" Martha announced, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "To a brilliant auditor, a fierce protector, and the only person in this family who ever knew the true value of hard work." The table erupted in cheers, glasses clinking together in a joyous, genuine celebration. I smiled, raising my own glass. I looked around the room, taking in the faces of the family I had actively chosen. People who respected my intellect, valued my loyalty, and supported my success. I thought back to the cold, devastating moment a year ago when I had watched my mother toast to Brittany's fraudulent mansion. I had felt so broken then, so convinced that my exclusion was a tragic, insurmountable failure. Now surrounded by light, warmth, and absolute security, I realized the undeniable truth. Being excluded from their fake, toxic table was not a failure. It was the greatest, most profound blessing of my entire life. My name is Elise, and if my journey has taught me anything, it is that the blood in your veins does not obligate you to tolerate abuse. For years, I believed that if I just worked harder, achieved more, and played the right game, my family would finally see my worth. I thought sitting alone at that empty Thanksgiving table was the ultimate failure. But it was actually the universe pulling back the curtain on a toxic illusion. We are constantly conditioned to protect our family at all costs, to keep the peace and forgive the unforgivable. But when the people who are supposed to be your safe harbor turn out to be the ones actively sinking your ship, you have to stop handing them life preservers. Loyalty should never come at the expense of your own financial or emotional survival. My parents and sister built their entire world on fraud and entitlement, using my spotless record to fund their fake lives. They mistook my desire for connection as weakness. What I learned is that true power does not come from screaming or acting out. It comes from stepping back, gathering the absolute facts, and letting the natural consequences of their toxic actions crush them. When I finally stopped trying to earn a seat at their fraudulent table, I was able to build my own. True family is chosen. It is made of the people who celebrate your victories, defend your name in your absence, and never ask you to shrink yourself to make them comfortable. If you are watching this and dealing with toxic relatives who drain your energy or exploit your success, please listen to me. Your worth is not determined by their ability to recognize it. You are entirely allowed to walk away. Have you ever had to set ironclad boundaries to protect yourself from toxic family members? Share your stories in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories about reclaiming your power and building a life you truly deserve.